Welcome everyone to the Budget Committee meeting to consider the 2020-2022 proposed budget. All members of committee are present today. Do we have everyone here? We do. Now that they're in their seats, Councillor Fertini. Members of committee, there are a few agenda changes identified on the package in front of you. I'll ask the city clerk to review the changes for today's agenda since its publication last Friday.
Brown, you have before you a proposed consolidated agenda. Changes are in red. I'll just scroll through. We have item 4.1, the presentations from the CAO and Treasurer. That was distributed today on the website. We have also an additional possible delegation, a delegation from Mark Seba, Brampton resident, and that was also published today. We have item 7.6, a presentation from the BIA that was published on the website today. And we have a number of items of correspondence, 1 through 5, also of which are now on the website available. And it is my understanding we've just handed out onto your desks right at this moment items 4.6, which was listed on the agenda to begin with, and there is a proposed additional item 4.7 entitled 2020 Proposed Operating and Capital Budgets Pre-Budget Discussion that we would propose to be added to the agenda.
Thank you.
And those are your changes.
Are there any other additions, changes, or deletions to the agenda? Seeing none, we have a motion moved by, I don't have my, the motion is done up?
No,
okay,
it's
so
this committee.
A motion moved by Councillor Santos, seconded by Councillor Willens. All those in favor of the amended motion? Motion carries. Do any members have a declaration of pecuniary interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act for any matter to be considered on today's agenda? Councillor Bowman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In an abundance of caution, I will declare conflict when we get to the economic development budget and the community grants, as my son does a little bit of work for one of the groups that's on the community grant list.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bowman. That will be noted. Councillor Willens.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I would like to declare a conflict on the Public Works section under the, I guess it's under the salary, as my brother and nephew both work for the Public Works Department.
Thank you, Councillor Willens. That will be so noted. Councillor Fertini.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm declaring a conflict as my daughter works part-time for bylaws.
Thank you, Councillor Fertini. That will be so noted. The clerk will so note for the meeting minutes. The items listed with an asterisk on the agenda are considered to be routine and non-controversial. The consent motion is to adopt this matter on today's agenda without the need for a separate discussion on the item unless a member requests a separate discussion. We have no items listed for today's consent motion. Does any member wish to add an item to consent? Seeing none, I will proceed. And before we start with the presentations, I just want to say a few things. One, we're going to be having these budget meetings over the next week and a half here at City Hall in the afternoon, but we also have a few evening sessions. I know last year we had some people that expressed concern that they worked during the day and wouldn't have the opportunity to participate. Rest assured, we've spread these out over the week, so any citizen that wants to have an opportunity to be heard, to have their voice heard, will have that opportunity. We're also having a tele-town hall tonight, so if you want to speak with us live, we're going to have a tele-town hall from 7 to 8 p.m. Every resident of Brampton is allowed to participate, ask questions, and we'll have some interactive questions where we can actually poll the city on priorities, and so that will be this evening. Before we hear from the staff presentation, I just want to put a slide up on the screen for members of the public and council to take a look at. This is the list of how we compare in the GTA. This is the current tax rates for all our competitors in the GTA, and it just highlights that we still have a lot of work to do. And so when we're doing work on economic development, I can tell you what comes up every single time is the bottom line of how we compare on tax rates. Obviously, they look at gridlock as well and availability of human resources. But if we want to bring industry to the city, this is the chart we need to continue to look at and monitor ourselves. So as we look at new spending initiatives in this budget, please keep in mind this chart right here, because it's how we compare. this is how we're doing compared to our competitions on having a competitive tax rate for industry that's looking at the GTA. And Toronto Global, when they pitch our region to the world, they share this data with them. It's not a secret. So I just want all of council at the start of each day to be mindful of where we stand and how we change this and how we compete. And I guess this goes beyond the GTA. Hamilton's in here, so this is the GTHA. But you get a sense of what it looks like. We have presentations now, but were there, I see two members up on the board. Did they want to make any, do they have any questions before we start the presentations? Okay, Councillor Fertini. Oh, sir, we lost you there for a second. Can we get Councillor Fertini back on the board? Okay. Oh.
Taking me off. Am I on?
Is he on?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want, are we doing presentation for every department? Or we just,
Well, the
we should
CEO
have every department do the presentation?
Thank you, Mayor, through you. So the commission's areas will be presented, and I believe it is on the agenda as well in front of you, both capital and operating.
So all five or six departments? Is that what we're saying?
Okay. Councillor Paleshi.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just in terms of this tax rate that we're looking at, who's BMA Management Consulting? How accurate is this information? Does it include the regional budget, and does it include any levies?
Through the chair, this is the 2019 tax rates. It's 100% accurate. Includes, it's the total blended rate, so the city, region, and school boards for each of these. Obviously, some of these municipalities are single tier, but it's a comparable tax rate for each.
Does it include any levies?
Through the chair, so depending on each of the municipalities' budgets, there are some municipalities here that I do know include levies in their budget. So in those cases, this would, for those municipalities, it would include, this tax rate would have levies embedded in that, those property taxes.
And does it include our levy?
Through the chair, yes, it does.
Which municipalities does it have, does it not include their levy?
Through the chair, I can't speak to every municipality. I know Mississauga would have a levy.
That's not included in that?
No,
No, everything's included.
this is their property taxes from 2019.
Okay,
It's not the 2020
right.
proposed tax rate.
Are there municipalities on this list that have levies that are not included in this rate?
Through the chair, this is the levy that each of these, this is the tax rate that is derived from the levy requirement for each municipality, which would include, if they had an infrastructure levy or some other levy, would be included in that amount.
I think what Dave is trying to say is some municipalities don't have levies, and that's why it wouldn't show. Brampton is one of the few that has gone out and had a transit and infrastructure levy. So whatever your tax bill is shown here, if the city doesn't have a levy, it wouldn't show because they don't have it.
Okay. That's not what you just said.
No, that's exactly what I was saying. I was saying that,
You said there was municipalities that did not have levies included in their tax rate.
no, I said that they may not collect levies within their,
They don't have levies.
correct.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we start? Okay. As we begin to formally consider the 2020 budget, I would like to ask Mr. David Barrick, CEO, and Mr. David Sutton, Director of Finance, Treasurer, Corporate Services, to please come forward to provide a presentation about the 2020 budget and recommendations. After the presentation, committee can then ask its questions as we can start to consider the 2020 budget. I understand copies of your slides were provided at the start of the meeting and will be published online for the public to access and reference during the meeting. Mr. Barrick and Mr. Sutton, please come forward for your presentation and welcome.
Great, thank you, Mayor and Council. It's a true pleasure to be here today to present the proposed 2020 budget for your consideration. And I would say, I believe, if the clerk can verify that these presentations are live and accessible to the public currently for anyone who wants to follow along at home. And so I'll just get right into it with respect to our approach for the 2020 draft budget, or proposed budget. As you can see, first and foremost, from a staff perspective, it's to maintain the high quality of services that we currently have, maintain and or enhance our levels of service, while at the same time limiting property tax increases. We've heard loud and clear from this council with their notion of no to low tax levy increases, and so we have that top of mind in terms of presenting this budget today. Building a resilient economy to create opportunities for growth, and part of that is exactly in line with what the mayor had just said about tax rates being tied to building the resilient economy and opportunities for growth. Further, it's to actually implement your term of council priorities, which you know very well: opportunities, green, health and safety, well-run city, and mosaic. And each of those have specific deliverables within them that we are investing in, tracking, and be prepared to report back to you. So how did we get here today in February? Well, last year, starting I believe last spring to summer, we look at the business needs and reviews every year. This is normal practice when considering our budgets, reviewing past performance, revising our plans, updating our plans, and identifying any changes and or areas that require further investment. Some areas are under-resourced, some areas are over-resourced, looking at all those things. This council knows that there was a regional governance review at that time that didn't get resolved until, I believe, October or November. And so that was one consideration for this council to push this budget process off until we understand what that was. New legislation is also come into effect with respect to Bill 108 and understanding what the implications of that is. And there's 7 service reviews, many of which didn't get completed until December or even January of this year. And KPMG will be here later today to talk to you a little bit about what those reviews look like, without getting into too much detail, but how they implicate and impact the 2020 budget, and we will have checkpoints moving forward for further options for your consideration. We've examined our operating capital budget submissions and prioritized based on your term of council priorities. We've received and continue to receive public input and consultation. The mayor referenced telephone town hall this evening. That's correct, at 7 p.m. There's a community satisfaction survey by Forum Research. They're here today to tell you a little bit more about their findings, and the ongoing online feedback, which residents can submit online anytime and or come to these budget meetings. Many citizens have signed up to be delegation through this process as well. So we're listening, and we take those into consideration from a formulating draft perspective. And of course, the final step is your leadership, your review, and your approval. As outlined earlier, the considerations going into this budget process, you can see them there: legislative changes, service reviews, community engagement, historical trends, our master plans, which includes a community energy and emissions reduction plan, economic development, parks and rec, et cetera. All those are taken into account, as well as our asset management long-term financial plans, revised on an annual basis. And so the 2020 budget key information, I would say, from my perspective, was really the guiding principles in formulating the draft before you today. A big component is just budgeting to actuals. Where we see historical large surpluses, well, we budget to the actual. Where we see historical deficits in line items, well, we budget to actuals. And so that's important from a tracking perspective. Critical, though, in this process, from a guiding principle perspective, is to maintain our reserve balances. And not only to maintain our reserve balances, but to maintain our annual contributions to reserves. And that's done in this draft budget as well. Service levels no different right at the outset. Maintain and or enhance service levels across the board. You have that here before you today. It's important to note as well, we often talk purely about the levy, but it's important for the public perspective and certainly council to understand the gross expenditures, or the gross budget, is up 6.7% in this proposal that you have in front of you. $48 million more in 2020 than in 2019. And so the total draft before you, $756 million operating 2020. And we'll talk about the levy, what that looks like a little bit separately. Workforce as well, we're adding FTEs, 45 in fact. Our tax rate in the levy side, we're coming in at 1.2 City of Brampton tax rate. That includes the 1% transit levy that was introduced last year. That's added another 1% this year. The 2% levy for infrastructure, again, added an additional 2% this year. That's embedded in this proposal. And so, again, we heard council, I believe there were some workshops and in our conversations in terms of an ability and or options to get to zero and or to increase or enhance services. And so you have those options before you. There was, I believe, a handout submitted that you have to review over the next couple of days. Before we actually get to that discussion item, I wanted to flag it because our job is to give information and options, and you select and we implement. We do have a pathway forward if this council would like to go to a 0% levy without impacting services. We also have options for increasing investments in certain areas like transit, economic development, and others for your consideration. Ultimately, before you, again, as I stated, and this is an important note, the City of Brampton is a 0% levy increase. However, we've identified purely and specifically because of provincial impacts, which is about $5.7 million, things such as additional costs related to Presto because of the loss of the additional gas tax, et cetera. Those provincial impacts equate to 1.2%. So the city is 0, provincial impacts 1.2%. When you add in the region of Peel, which was a 3.4% on their end, and you blend the rate, so region of Peel, City of Brampton, School Board, we're coming in at a total of 1.8% on the homeowner's tax bill at the end of the day. Understanding as well, we've identified that CPI, inflation, is 1.9%. So this proposal comes under inflation on a total bill. You can see here the breakup, just what I've identified, of when a resident gets their tax bill. 46% is the City of Brampton, 38% portion to the region, the balance to the school board. The impact that you see here, we've added assessed value, because we tax on assessed value, and it may be a highlight to you that market rate may be much greater. Dave Sutton, the treasurer, will speak a little bit more about assessment versus market value, but from our purposes, MPAC, the province, gives us the tax information from which to bill. And so for a single-family detached home that's assessed at $619,000, that would equate to a tax bill of about $5,900. The total operating budget in 2020 proposed is $756 million. That includes, as you may know, staff salaries, maintenance, utilities, reserves, et cetera. Reserve contributions, that is. The capital side is $223 million, and that's for purchases, major repairs, replacement of assets, et cetera. I've also asked that this slide identify what the total reserves are of the municipality. And so you're aware it's $480 million in reserves. I've also asked that demonstrate what the deferred revenues are. And deferred revenues are separate than reserves, but they are still monies coming into the municipality. That's $300 million. The total approved debt on the other side of the ledger is $250 million. So the City of Brampton is in good shape. You'll see, again, we are building on your 2019 accomplishments. We've recently put out the City of Brampton highlights, 2019 highlights, and I really want to thank staff for all their work in implementing the term of council priorities to date. Council makes the decisions and the resource allocations, but staff on a daily basis are the ones implementing, and they're doing a phenomenal job. The community satisfaction survey by Forum, you'll hear from them directly, but a couple of highlights: 77% of residents agree they receive good value for their tax dollars, and that's good news. You don't often see that kind of result from municipalities, so we're doing something right. 73% of residents say they are satisfied with city services. Again, that's the service delivery, customer service, responsiveness. Planning for a growing city, this is information that this council is very familiar with. Again, second fastest growing city in Canada, ninth largest, total population 456,000. Number of businesses are up, number of jobs are up, and we have a very diverse, multicultural workforce, and it is highly educated as well. We're centrally located. We're close to the largest supply of vacant land adjacent to the Toronto Pearson International Airport, and we have an increasing number of housing permits. We're growing by about 14,000 people a year every year. And so that is good news, but also identifies some of the challenges moving forward in terms of being ready on an annual basis and looking forward. The investments, again, I've asked staff to identify how exactly are we investing and implementing, how is this budget investing and implementing in your term of council priorities? And so you have the budget binders in front of you, and there's very specific in terms of dollar amounts, but I want to flag a couple here for you. Each of your areas, opportunities. Building the Innovation District in downtown Brampton, we're investing in. $5 million to support Rogers, Cybersecurity Catalyst, and Ryerson Innovation Zone. Continuing advocacy with business community partners for post-secondary education. On attracting investments to grow the economy, we're advancing the FDI strategy to drive new investments and jobs in the city. We also have a 10-year tourism strategy to improve competitiveness of Brampton as a destination. On Green City, our commitment to sustainability in transit and transportation is first and foremost on a regular basis. 8 new electric buses hit the street this year. We're investing in smart buses. We continue to advocate and focus our regional connections through the Queen Street BRT, the Huron-Ontario LRT projects. We're retrofitting our LED streetlights to become more energy efficient at city facilities and using that money to reinvest in those energy efficient programs. The 1 million tree program, there will be a report forthcoming tomorrow in terms of how exactly are we achieving that target. And that's 50,000 trees a year. Health and safe, $2 million for new youth centers. We're upgrading our recreation centers as well as our sport field developments. Keeping our community safer, there's $8 million being invested in our fire prevention education investments in fire stations. And I know, which is important to this council, community safety, which means and includes photo radar and community safety zones. Being a well-run city, so we're maintaining and upgrading our roads and active transportation infrastructure, I believe $40 million. Our technology upgrades to become more effective in our digital experience, upgrading our Presto fare collection system, et cetera. Our Mosaic deliverables, we're advancing the Brampton Fund to support nonprofit projects, I believe $1 million there. We're joining the community in hosting cultural events and celebrations on a regular basis, flag raising events to raise awareness on key causes and cultural expressions. And as this council may know, offer translations in 11 languages to connect with the diverse community. And so the baseline budget proposal here, inclusive of investing in your term of council priorities and everything that I've talked about so far, on a blended rate is a 0.5% property tax increase on the city's portion. Now this is important. It includes the 2% infrastructure levy, and it includes the 1% transit levy. And again, if you add in the region appeal and the school boards, it's a 1.8% tax increase. We've identified scenarios for you to consider to dial it down or dial it up as you see fit. KPMG will be presenting today as well to speak to you a little bit about their analysis on the service reviews and the implications for 2020, as well as the public feedback through forum today. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dave Sutton, our treasurer. He has additional detail, and then we're happy to take questions from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Mayor Brown, members of council, fellow colleagues, and members of the public. Today, I will be presenting more detail on the proposed 2020 operating and capital budgets. The proposal that is in front of you culminated from many months of deliberations with our management team and staff right across this corporation, and what we believe is a very positive proposal for our ratepayers in the city of Brampton. As you heard from our CAO, the blended property tax impact based on this proposal that is in front of you is 1.8%. This is lower than the current rate of inflation. The city's portion of this property tax impact is 0.5%, while the regional impact is 1.3%. There is no impact from the school boards. Now, before I go into too much detail on the 2020 operating and capital budgets, I just wanted to step back a bit and just wanted to spend a few minutes reminding the public on how property tax rates are derived. So for the city's share of the property tax rate, we start first with determining the city's budgetary requirements for the fiscal year. After accounting for all operating expenditures and offsetting these with other revenue sources such as user fees, grants, and investment income, the difference or residual amount to be funded is what is known as the property tax levy. We then take this property tax levy requirement and divide it by the total weighted assessment value provided by MPAC as legislated by the province. The resulting formula drives what is known as the property tax rate. So you may ask, what are MPAC assessment values for 2020 in Brampton? Well, there are over 156,000 residential units in Brampton. For 2020, approximately 53% of MPAC assessment values fall between $400,000 and $600,000, with another 18% falling in the $200,000 to $400,000 range, and 21% falling in the $600,000 to $800,000 range. Outside of these ranges, there are many less properties. What is also shown is the average MPAC assessment value for the properties which fall within each of these ranges, as well as the total blended property tax bill for each of those average assessment values, inclusive of the city's 1.8% blended property tax increase. And that's indicated below the chart. I'll now move on to the breakdown of the proposed 2020 operating budget. So the proposed 2020 operating budget is $756 million, as you just heard from our CAO, an increase of $48 million or 6.7% over 2019. Of the increase, $11.8 million of the increase is tied to maintaining or enhancing service. We have $14.5 million included in this budget for infrastructure and transit levies, for additional infrastructure and transit levies, and $22 million for stormwater contributions. The total expenditure budget is comprised of 56% salaries and wages and benefits, 15% is comprised of those contributions for the infrastructure and transit levies and stormwater. About 6% is required for minor maintenance and materials, 5% for contracted services, and 5% is for utilities and fuel. The proposed 2020 operating budget is primarily funded through property taxes. About 66% of the expenditure budget is funded through property taxes, and 28% is funded through user fees. On this next chart, you will find each department, its respective expenditures, revenues, and effectively the portion of its operations that is subsidized by property taxes. The total tax levy requirement in this budget proposal is $502 million, or $5.7 million greater than in 2019. As previously mentioned by our CAO, this increase is 100% attributable to changes in provincial legislation or downloading. For our part, the city has been able to contain base operating and gross costs, inclusive of new assessment growth, while still delivering the same service that was in place for 2019. In fact, in some key operational areas, we are enhancing service with the addition of 45 new full-time staff. We are also proposing to phase in debt servicing costs for the Center of Innovation over the next 3 years to align better with the construction schedule, while still recognizing this council's decision to proceed with this important project. This results in some immediate but temporary relief on the property tax bill for 2020. This proposal also continues with the previous guidance by including the 2% infrastructure levy and 1% transit levy, which are necessary to ensuring infrastructure is maintained in a state of good repair and to provide transit with a dedicated and stable source of funding to invest for future transit needs. We've been able to achieve the above while holding budgetary requirements steady at a 0% average property tax change. Ultimately, it is the decisions made at the province that are driving the budgetary increase for the city of 1.2% or 0.5% on the overall tax bill. One of the key points for the development of this year's budget is that assessment growth has been at the lowest growth rate in a very long time. This reflects a decline in residential building permit issuance over the past 2 to 3 years. This current slowing of growth is reflective in the budget submission as additional service enhancements have been added at a pace in line with this resulting pace in population growth. This next chart further demonstrates the impact of slowing growth on our development charge collections. These changes in development charge cash flows drive the multi-year capital budget proposal, ensuring that infrastructure is being added at a rate in line with population growth. On this following chart, what we do is we break down the major increases and decreases pertaining to the base operating and growth portion of the budget. So as you can see, in terms of some of the major increases, we have compensation adjustments. These are resulting from collective bargaining agreements. We have an increase in our winter control costs to service winter maintenance services. We have other operating adjustments throughout the city. As the CAO had pointed out, we always make refinements to the budget to align budgets and actuals. And we also have another $1 million for the 45 new full-time staff. On the decreasing side, or the efficiency side, we have new assessment growth of $5.3 million. Again, a low compared to many prior years. We have made adjustments in terms of our tax administration section. We have brought in some of the revenue that will be generated from the stormwater fee to help offset costs tied to our stormwater program that will be implemented. We have internal loans maturing, so that is actually freeing up some room within this budget. We have additional revenue adjustments. So we've seen over the past several years, revenues have grown at an exponential rate. And those adjustments have been reflected in this budget submission. We are also reflecting $1.3 million in street lighting LED efficiencies, which demonstrates the city's commitment to finding ways that we can improve the green city. And we have $1 million in proposed recreation user fees, of which a report will be considered later on in the budget deliberations. As mentioned, we are proposing 45 new full-time staff adds to further enhance service in some key areas such as building and planning divisions, public works, and enforcement. Full details on these positions are included in the public document that's in front of you. As stated in our last State of Local Infrastructure report, the city had assets with a current replacement value of $5.8 billion. The city's 2020 budget proposal reflects $123 million in infrastructure repair and replacement contributions by way of the infrastructure levy, federal gas tax, and stormwater fee. Depreciation of those assets using historical cost, the cost at which assets were acquired or constructed, is $135 million annually. However, at the current value of replacement, the city would require annual funding of $213 million to ensure assets are maintained to deliver service our residents and businesses come to expect. This next chart indicates how infrastructure and transit levies are increasing with this budget proposal. For 2020, the 2% infrastructure levy will increase the annual contribution by another $9.7 million to $73 million. If the city continues to increase the levy at 2% annually, the contribution will grow to $94 million by 2022. In 2019, the city first introduced the 1% transit levy to provide a dedicated and stable source of funding to support transit investment. With this budget proposal, an additional annual 1% contribution has been included, thereby increasing annual contributions to $9.6 million. If the city continues to increase the transit levy at 1% annually, this contribution will grow to $20 million by 2022. Finally, I would just like to highlight the critical importance both of these contributions have in their ability to make it possible for the city to leverage additional funding from the federal and provincial governments for cost-sharing infrastructure arrangements. Without city funding, leveraging these infrastructure funds from the federal or provincial governments would not be possible. So typically when we think of infrastructure, it is assets such as roads, bridges, recreational centers, buses that we think of. However, there is a significant amount of infrastructure that is hidden below the ground, out of sight, out of mind. This infrastructure is critical in managing the stormwater runoff from properties and roads. The current replacement value of these assets is $1.2 billion. Beginning in 2020, a new fee will be included on the region's water bill as a dedicated source of funding for this significant and important infrastructure. This fee has the effect of shifting the burden to those who contribute most to our stormwater challenges, effectively from residential to non-residential properties. The new fee provides a means to keep people and communities safe from flooding, prevent damage to property, minimize the social and environmental disruptions and impacts flooding can have. It should be noted that many other municipalities in the province have already including some of our most closest neighbors, have already implemented such a fee. This chart you've seen before. It is the chart that indicates the infrastructure gap over the foreseeable future. The infrastructure gap, which is currently around $300 to $400 million, would grow to just over $700 million by 2027, assuming only the annual 2% infrastructure levy increase is sustained. With the introduction of the new stormwater fee, the infrastructure gap would grow to just under $600 million by 2027, a significant improvement. As previously mentioned, the city's net budget increase is 100% the result of changes in provincial legislation or downloading. The decision by the province to not double provincial gas tax results in revenue shortfall of $2.5 million on a year-over-year budget basis. Additionally, doubling of the provincial gas tax revenue would have contributed an additional $13 million annually over the next several years as the increase was phased in, which would have provided a significant source of funding for additional transit enhancements. There is also a change in the agreement to utilize the Presto service, which results in higher fees charged to the city of $1.5 million. And the city continues to phase in adjustments resulting from the previous provincial government's decision to increase minimum wages. This is the final year of the multi-year phase-in plan and results in a budgetary increase of $1.2 million. And finally, approximately $600,000 can be attributed initially to the impacts of Bill 108 to provide funding for new staff in planning to manage expedited turnaround times on development applications and to manage appeals. Further impacts of Bill 108 are to be anticipated in future budgets as staff continue to fully work through the new regulation and implement the requirements. As for the proposed 2020 to 2022 capital budgets, the 2020 budget has $223 million. For 2022-21, there is a $593 million forecasted proposal in front of you, which includes $175 million for a new transit storage facility and $58 million for Williams Parkway, which were recently deferred to align with project commencement. And those were deferred from 2020, the previous 2020 capital budget forecast. and we have $313 million for 2022. I should point out, for 2020, the tax-funded capital program is actually $12 million higher than the forecast we'd actually put forward in front of council last year. For the proposed 2020 capital budget, Public Works makes up approximately 37% of the budget, Transit 31%, and Community Services 18%. In terms of its funding sources, approximately 39% it comes from the property tax base. We have 23% that is made up of the Investing in Canada infrastructure program, and development charges make up 19%. I would like to note that the proposed 2020 to 2022 capital budgets met departmental submission requests. This next slide just highlights the top 5 capital projects in the request for each of the next 3 years. The city's reserves are actually very healthy, and it demonstrates our fiscal responsibility and prudency. Staff continue to review and revise the city's practices to ensure the most prudent management of our tax dollars. $195 million in obligatory reserves, which means they can only be utilized for legislative purposes in which they were established, which include reserves such as the cash in lieu of parkland, the building rate stabilization reserve, development charges, and federal gas tax funds. We also have $285 million in discretionary reserves, which includes reserves such as the Legacy Fund, Community Investment Fund, General Rate Stabilization Reserve, and Hospital Reserve. There are a number of commitments made for several strategic initiatives which will result in a drawdown of these funds over the foreseeable future. The General Rate Stabilization Reserve continues to protect the city's operations in the event of an economic downturn or unforeseen catastrophic event. The Hospital Reserve holds a $20 million balance that was raised previously through a special hospital levy for Phase 2 of Peel Memorial redevelopment. This proposed budget does not include a hospital levy. Staff recently met with members of the Osler team, and it would appear that the scope of their project does not align with the recent feedback from council regarding the healthcare needs and priorities of the city. Additional consultation will need to take place, and it may be premature to include a hospital levy in the budget at this time. With the passing of this budget proposal, the city's General Rate Stabilization Reserve target of 10% of operating expenditures would increase the requirement to $75.6 million. The current balance in this reserve is $68.5 million. Staff has revisited the formula for the General Rate Stabilization Reserve and are recommending that the formula be adjusted to account for a net out of contributions to reserve, which are controllable and not subject to similar volatility resulting from an economic downturn or unforeseen event. After netting off reserve contributions, the target would be revised to $64 million. This would have the effect of having a fully funded GRS reserve and freeing up $4.5 million on a one-time basis, which has not yet been accounted for in this budget. Staff have, however, proposed an efficiency opportunity for further consideration in the handouts you've received. The DC forecast implies that after accounting for funding of the proposed 2020 capital budget, the forecasted DC balance would be $52 million at the end of 2020 based on the current development forecast. The city's debt policy currently allows for the issuance of $1.3 billion in debt or annual debt servicing costs of $83 million. To put this in perspective, for every $72 million borrowed for tax-supported capital projects, this would be the equivalent of a 1% tax levy impact on the city's portion of the tax bill. The city's credit rating is AAA stable. While this rating does not affect the borrowing rate at which the region of Peel borrows at on behalf of the city, it does indicate solid financial management of the city's resources and signals to investors that Brampton is a good location to establish and expand their business. Brampton continues to approach debt financing in a conservative and responsible way. We continue to promote the use of debt for strategic purposes, aligning with economic prosperity, development intensification, and improving community pride and healthy lifestyle. We do not recommend or only limited use of debt issuance for organic growth, repair and replacement, and in addition, the city is not able, under current legislation, to borrow for day-to-day operations or to provide grants. In terms of the external debt issuance and approvals, currently we have $250 million of projects that have been or will be approved through capital projects, with debt financing costs built into the budgets, and as indicated above. Of this amount, only $26 million has actually been issued to date for the new fire headquarters. We also have capital leases and a performance guarantee, capital lease for the West Tower and a performance guarantee for the CAA Center. So, in other words, to sum things up, in terms of the city's budgetary increase, we require 1.2%, of which I mentioned 100% of that is the result of the provincial decisions. That equates to a 0.5% impact on the overall tax bill, or $27. The Region of Appeals' 3.4% budgetary increase results in a 1.3% impact on the overall tax bill, or $64 on the average home. There is no change for the school boards, and the resulting overall property tax bill will see a 1.8% increase, of which is a $91 impact on the average assessed home. Thank you very much for listening. A document has been prepared for all of you with the questions and responses that were asked during our pre-budget briefings with members of council this past week, which has already been handed out. And in addition, we will gladly address any questions you may have later on in budget deliberations regarding the additional handout being provided to you regarding additional opportunities for efficiencies and enhancements. Mr. Mayor, I now turn it back to you.
Charlotte, for some direction here, we can ask questions of David now?
Yes.
Do we receive the report first, or do we?
You can receive the presentation and then ask questions.
Okay, so a motion to receive the presentation. Councillor Pelletier, second by Councillor Vicente. All those in favor? Motion carries, and now we have some questions. Councillor Fertini.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to David, a couple of questions. Thank you. So we're asking for 45 employees for this year. Last year was 238, I think, in total. The last 2019.
Through the chair, I don't have the number. I can get you the number.
Okay. So when we approve the budget, around 45, let's say we hire them September, where's that money go to from now till September? I don't.
Through the chair, so because you're correct, we fully annualize a new staff person when we budget for them in the year. Effectively, there is what is called it'd be a surplus effectively for the current year. So part of the surplus that results every year is the reality that we have just hired or budgeted for a new body or a new position in this budget, and those people will not necessarily be on day one, January 1st. They would come on possibly May, June of the year, by the time we've gone through interviews and recruitment. So there would be a surplus in the first year, but then as that person's on, after that, you wouldn't have those surpluses.
I get that. So in the book, I'm going through, we just got this one, because I was going through that one, I couldn't find it. So if we hire 200 people, and they're hired in August, and we approve the budget in January, February, like now, we should show a line, how many people are hired, and how much money was saved, and where it went. I can't find it. I don't see it. So you just put it as a surplus. It all goes in one package. On the 45 people now, like, once we approve this, it's the same thing. So if we hire them in September or August, from now until then, that money sits in the bank account, right?
Through the chair, there's about $1 million impact from all of the hirings that are here. If you do not fully budget this year for those positions, you will have an impact next year. It would be an automatic increase next year because, and effectively that why a number of years ago, a former council made that decision to move to fully annualize positions, and so we've continued that practice.
So we didn't all fill all the positions last year, I guess. Didn't all fill, am I correct?
Pardon me, sorry.
All the positions that we asked for from last year, the 238 people, are they all filled, or I think they're not all filled, right?
Through you, Mayor, majority of those positions have been filled, but throughout the year, as we have retirements and replacements, we continue to fill those roles. But the 2019 budget positions have been filled.
Okay. And on the park, last question, we had that $1 million enhancement to help each park. Are we gonna put in again for this year? Or do we have to ask that at the end?
Through the chair, that's not included in this budget. So that was done through
And
the
the Hanson.
surplus funds from the 2018 year end.
So can't we use that surplus now for the extra wages that we didn't hire that was put in the surplus?
Through the chair, you can't reuse the same funds as those. We've now adjusted our budgets through 2019 to properly align and right-size the budget. We are, later on in the deliberations, we will be getting to the Q3 report for discussion and have some discussion in terms of the surplus and whether that's a potential source of funds for any additional enhancements that council may want to make.
Yeah. And last budget, we took it off of the general rate stabilization, that $1 million, am I correct? Out of the 68 million, we took the $1 million out of there.
Through the chair,
2019,
2019.
yeah. Where did that $1 million come from? I thought it came from the stabilization. 68 million. Okay, we can look at it. But I want to add that, so when it comes to discussion, I want to add that again because it was really good for the parks. That's all, just a reminder. Okay.
If I may, Chair, on that point, the treasurer is correct. The Q3 report that has been punted to these meetings identifies the potential use for your consideration on the surplus. And so it sounds like that's what occurred last year, and so you have the opportunity again. There's between $10 to $15 million surplus that's not built anywhere into this base budget. One-time funding for your consideration to add wherever you see fit.
Okay, thank you.
I think councilors are gonna get excited if they hear 10 to 15 million one-time funding is coming up. Yeah, last year we did have a surplus, and it was supposed to go to the GRS, and then that's where motions came, if you recall, for FDI, active transportation, and for the park enhancement. And so I just wanted to, I guess, get clarity on the GRS. What's the revised 10% GRS target methodology? What does that mean exactly?
Through the chair. So currently what we do is we take our gross expenditure budget for operation. So for instance, $756 million we've talked about, and we take 10% of that.
Yeah.
And we say that's our target.
Exactly.
What we're actually recommending to council this time around is that because there's a significant portion of that operating budget that is actual controllable contributions to reserves, we're actually going to deduct that off the $756 million first, and then calculate our 10%. And therefore, that reduces our, when you calculate 10% on that reduced number, it'd be $640 million. You only require a GRS target of $64 million.
Okay. Okay, so it's not technically 10% anymore.
Correct.
Right?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And because reserve contributions will change from year to year, the number will vary from year to year as well.
Okay.
But we're suggesting that it's a controllable expense.
Yeah.
It's not sort of subject to the same volatility as our day-to-day operations, frontline services, or some sort of unexpected, unforeseen event.
Okay, and seems like since there's going to be a net GRS surplus anyways of $4.5 million. I would be open to Councilor Frattini's suggestion as well, seeing that was probably one of the most meaningful things I did as a councilor, just like basketball courts, swing sets, and parks. Like the amount of citizens that appreciate that, the youth that appreciate that, is extremely rewarding, and our city really, and our residents really appreciated that. So I don't want to make this an annual budget, but if we do have the wiggle room this year to continue the park enhancement fund for one more year, maybe, I would definitely be open for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Singh. Councillor Palashi.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to start along the service reviews and just timelines, David, could you go into a little bit, you spoke about, you know, some of the service reviews that are coming before us today, and then kind of, can you go more into the timelines? Like, I know council said late last year we initiated the service reviews. Was it late last year? So council kind of, you know, was gung-ho about, you know, doing the service reviews, but we understand that this is a massive corporation, so things are going to take time. So can you talk a little bit about the timelines and maybe the just around that?
Yes, thank you, through you, Mayor, to the councillor. Council passed a resolution, I believe, last summer. There was some provincial dollars going around at the time for the, I believe, the Audit and Accountability Fund. And so that was the impetus, I believe, for getting these third-party service reviews to find efficiencies and better ways to do municipal business. 3 of them were funded by the province, and then 4 were 100% funded by the municipality. And so there were 7, and council at the time as well added an overlay at KPMG. And so that's why they're here. The rationale, and that in your wisdom, foresaw that several different companies looking at several different service areas as kind of in isolation of each other, just to have that corporate lens. And that's why KPMG is here today. They will get into more detail in terms of their findings and observations and possible next steps. And so many of those service reviews didn't get completed until beginning of December. And I think in one case, even beginning of January. And so KPMG, therefore, really couldn't do their initial analysis until all the reviews were in. So they worked diligently. They worked quite well, given the time crunch that they had in terms of about 3 to 4 weeks turnaround to be prepared for today. You have a report in front of you, as well as a presentation they're bringing forward. The first kind of tranche of their work is mining for 2020 implications, and so they'll speak to that. That's not to say that's the end of it. There's more information. There's about 80, 81 kind of potential initiatives stemming as a result of all those other service reviews, and they're going to glean a little bit more into that, and then maybe a subsequent meeting after the budget process. In terms of,
and that's kind of what I wanted to know, and I just wanted to ensure that, you know, we're not standing up here today to say implement. Like, it's going to be a process. We're going to go through things and see what's right for Brampton and how we move forward. Williams Parkway, are we going to talk more about that when it comes to Public Works, or okay? Investments in the council priorities, as you touched on, council priorities really should be resident priorities, because we're hearing it from them. And when I look into some of the highlights for the priorities, it's going to be very difficult for us to, because they're multi-departmental, it's going to be difficult for us to kind of highlight and take some of the initiatives and speak about them here at the budget. Is there anything within the budget or on a go-forward basis, maybe when we're finalizing, that we can reference council priorities with whatever departmental or initiative that's going forward?
So I think I have your question, and so it's it's one of the rationales for the creation of the organizational performance division, to do the tracking, to ensure service delivery in those areas, and to report back to you. And you have, there's checkpoints in terms of if you want to add or change or amend. It's a very clear kind of checklist currently of here's the priority area, here's the specific deliverables to support that. And we have that kind of checklist, and we have, we understand what we need to do, subject to the resources required to get that done. And so we will, not in this budget process, but we will be coming back with an update, probably more like a midterm update on where we stand on delivering your council priorities. And I think that's kind of the question of how is it being communicated? We've done the 2019 highlights that identify. We'll do a midterm report as well as another annual highlight. So it's like that constant checkpoint. Right now, to your point, Councillor, I believe, it's not centralized in terms of tracking, in terms of delivery. There are some priorities that cross departments and functions, and so that's another rationale for the creation of the corporate projects division, is when there's a council priority that requires 3 or 4 divisions, it's centralized and coordinated to ensure the decision points and information, et cetera, moving forward.
And that's understandable. I think it's difficult for us to highlight or pinpoint some of the initiatives to one specific area or one specific department. Mr. Sutton, you had said, and I didn't catch the percentage, but you had said something to the effect that you had requested departments, or we had requested departments to come in around the budget, and there was a percentage of departments that came in at that budget?
Through the chair, yes, when we were talking about the capital submissions, the forecast, what I had mentioned was in terms of all the submissions the departments made, we had met those requirements. So all of those projects were funded.
So, okay,
So in many years past, many times the requests exceed the funding available for the program. This year, the requests came in and we had funding for all of the projects that came forward.
So 100% of the requests, 100% of the departments came in at the budget that we requested?
That's correct. Okay. Yeah, and I'm saying that's the request. That's not necessarily the need. The need may exceed the request, but it reflects, the timing at which we're able to proceed with a project, whether we have the resources in place to proceed with those projects. So all those things are considered when the departments submit their request and submission, and all of those were met with the funding that was available in the program.
Okay. And you had mentioned the hospital, and we don't have a hospital levy on this year, and just with there's ongoing discussions on what I guess council and the residents and the hospitals seem to think about a new hospital or expansions of hospitals. Are we gonna, when we get into, I don't see it anywhere in the budget, but is there an opportunity for us to highlight some of those and possibly earmark some potential for future levies to be added into future budgets? I know it's a tough question because really everything's kind of up in the air, and I know that Councillor Singh and the mayor are working hard on having those discussions, but is there an opportunity?
Thank you, through you, Mayor, to the councillor. So yes, there's always an opportunity. This is your budget. This is your process. Previously, council directed staff, go talk to the folks at Osler and have a conversation. We've done that. And so it's not really clear, or it certainly is not clearly articulated what the ask is for 2020 budget implications. That's why, so the treasurer made this commentary around maybe premature for this budget process, and I'd say maybe better suited for the 2021 budget process, which I would suggest was starting in a couple of months. Now, it's February we're approving, but we want to get back on track in terms of timelines to have this the next budget approved in November, which means we start earlier. So there was an MOU, as you know, around the issue of the hospital phase 1 and I believe phase 2. There's $60 million, 40 given to them, 20 still here. And so they haven't fully utilized the 20 that's still here waiting for them. And they haven't clearly articulated their specific ask and value proposition. In other words, what does the city get in return? Let me translate that. What does the community get in return for the investment in terms of specific number of beds or anything like that? So we don't have that answer yet. That's not to stop this council from having that conversation and having a discussion around an additional hospital levy. And if it's not 2020, then certainly 2021.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe just to the mayor, if at some point we can highlight where we are in that process, and, whether it's now or later on in the budget, and maybe reminding what the premier had announced for Brampton as well. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
And maybe would be helpful, given that question, obviously the hospital has some anticipations of contributions, and the city had previously signed an MOU for phase 1 and phase 2. I think what the expectations are now are going to be beyond what the city previously signed with the hospital. So maybe just for context, as we have this conversation at a later point, maybe, David, if you could share with all of council what you provided to me in terms of the previous MOU with the hospital. Okay. And just to note, we are in excess in our reserves in terms of what we were supposed to raise the first time, phase 1 and phase 2, but obviously we've asked the hospital to be more ambitious on phase 2, and their ask is already more ambitious than what was previously agreed to. So I think knowing all of that will be helpful, but that's definitely a cost that was going to be asked of us in the near future. Councillor Santos.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. So just a quick question about reserves. On the reserve side, we have 500 million approximately in reserves. Are we maximizing the interest that we get out of that 500 million, or is there opportunity for us to do better in terms of what we're getting?
Through the chair, so yes, we are maximizing the amount of revenue we can get. We try to look at our cash flows, our projected monthly cash flows, determine what's free and available to invest. It is a challenging environment for sure. You know, as you probably know from your own personal investments, if you're holding certain types of instruments such as bonds, you're not earning much on your money at these rates. But we take every investment. We did recently just begin to invest a very small portion of our fund in one funds, which is an equity portfolio that we are legislated to invest in. So those returns are slightly higher than our bond returns. But again, it's a very small portion of our budget. We are in a situation where we do sort of live day to day with the funds that we do have. We tend to collect the money for the projects and the operations that we deliver day to day. So, and if there's other initiatives that do come up from time to time, we'll have a requirement to draw on those funds. So it does make it challenging to, to invest longer term in investments that may yield much higher returns. There's a bit of greater risk that if you had to call on those funds, you'd actually be you'd actually be earning a negative return at that point in time.
And
So
yeah, go ahead.
if I may, thank you to jump in on this. It's certainly a conversation we've had internally because we have a line of sight with respect to next year and the year after in terms of the municipality's ability to continue to absorb these additional infrastructure levies with at or below inflation. We have our other pressures in the municipality and certainly pressures that this council wants to see delivered. So as part of that wholesome, fulsome picture of the municipal finance, we have talked about the investment side because there's substantial reserve, like there's a liquidity issue we can't ignore in terms of best utilization of those funds. And I think to the treasurer's point, currently is being maximized within the existing framework. But we have talked and we will talk about other potential options for this council to consider with respect to other areas of revenue besides just the tax levy. And so I would suggest that's something that we'll continue to have discussions to provide council for options for their consideration.
Great. Another question about reserves. So the LED street lighting efficiencies of 1.3 million, we've had some offline conversations about setting up, the potential to set up a reserve specifically to help with energy retrofits. Is there an opportunity to do that in this budget, or is there an update on how that is going?
Through the chair. So right now, the team is still working with the departments involved through Mr. Meneses' group to determine what that longer-term plan looks like in terms of the projects that we could actually look at investing in for energy efficiency and retrofits and so on. So we're still trying to determine what that plan looks like. And as we've had a discussion offline on this, it will require some seed money to begin the process of identifying projects that we could actually implement immediately with the possibility of any savings that are generated on the operating budget go back into a reserve to reinvest in more or additional energy efficiency projects.
Great, because that goes back to our commitment to being a green city and the SERP and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. It would be really great to see that. Because at the end of the day, if we don't reinvest or if we don't have a fund to continue reinvesting in energy efficiency, it's easy to just write it all off. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Santos. Councillor Willens.
Thank you, through you, acting mayor sort of thing. I guess this question is along the same line. Not on here.
It is now.
Okay. I guess this goes along lines with what Councillor Santos asked. Maybe this question's for you, Dave, and maybe perhaps Al. I know moving forward our new facilities are going to be as close to net zero as we can possibly get them. But can the external debt financing be used for retrofit programs of our existing building stock? Because our existing building stock at the time were built as efficient based on greenhouse gas emissions, based on energy use at that time, because some of our building stock are 20, 30 years old. There wasn't a big climate change emergency as there is now. Can we look, you don't have to answer now, but maybe we can look into that to see if debt financing could be used for some of our buildings, like South Fletcher's Sports Complex or something like Jim Archdeacon, some of the ones that aren't as efficient, not because of state of disrepair, but because just the way they were built at the time, they were as efficient as possible. Can we look into that, that they may be able to do that? Because I think it aligns with, not that it specifically says that in the Pan-Canadian framework on climate change, but it's in there, it does sort of, if you read between the lines, says that for a greener growth and climate change. So could we look at that possibly?
Through the chair, yes, Mr. Meneses and our team will look at that. From a legislative standpoint, there's no reason why you can't borrow for capital infrastructure that is tied to energy efficiencies and those types of retrofits. I think it would fall in that category of the healthy lifestyle of the community. So I wouldn't just say it's like just to replace an asset. What you're talking about is replacing an asset, but at with something that is more effective and efficient for the community.
Because that's pretty much the basis of the Toronto Atmospheric Fund and the retrofit programs that they're doing for the home energy retrofit. So if we can look at it, that would be fantastic, because it's something that maybe that might sort of help us push our tax base somewhere else and spread that over a long period of time. Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Willens. Councillor Bowman. Let's move over. Thank you. Thanks very much. Oh, am I on? My light's not on? There, thank you. Thank you very much. Dave, I want to go back to the slide you had as well with the rate stabilization fund, where we're looking at the potential of going below what we normally would have. why did we make that decision this year and not last year or previous years? Why are we looking at that now?
Through the chair, so if you recall, when we first implemented this target, it was back in 2016. Much of the work would have happened in 2015. Our reserves would have been significantly less at that time. So this year, so over those couple of years, we've continued to invest in the infrastructure levy. Last year, we introduced the transit levy. This year, we're introducing the stormwater fee as a contribution to the reserves as well. So the reserves have been climbing steadily and represents a greater and greater portion of the budget. So it's a reflection of the, we've just actually realized that has been an increasing contribution to the expenditure budget, and we just wanted to recommend taking that step to reflect that and recommend that we adjust for those contributions.
Okay, and so looking forward, is there any downside to doing that?
Through the chair, I think it's a prudent amount that we're still holding in the reserve. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know when the next economic downturn will come, how prolonged that downturn may be. It may be a few weeks, it could be a year, 2 years. When it's going to occur, I don't know if there's some sort of event like an ice storm or so on that happens again. Luckily, last time when we had the ice storm, the province did step up and did fund the majority of it. I'm not sure whether that would be the case under this provincial government, if that were the case. So you don't know when those events are going to happen and when you might need to draw on those funds. And although the amount seems sizable, given the size of our budget, it doesn't take long, and you would not have a lot left in your reserves. So I think it's a prudent amount. I'm not too cautious about that. You always have the opportunity of pulling back a bit on some of your services if you do need to manage your cash flows.
Okay, I'm just a little wary about pulling money back out of that fund, because 2 years ago, 3 years ago, even last year, we were talking about we don't seem to have enough in that fund if something were to happen. But all of a sudden, we don't know what could happen there. From a lot of indicators, we may be headed for an economic downturn. And so I don't know whether it's prudent this year to be looking at that, at moving that money out. So I just have some concerns with that, because 2 years ago, I asked the question right here when we were at budget, what happens if the gas tax money is not coming to us like it should be? And we sort of shrugged it off and said, oh no, the province has promised it to us, and 8 months later we're down to half of what we should have been. There was no doubling of the gas tax, so we were left with a little bit of a whoa moment. So I don't want that to happen again. We're supposed to be looking out for the municipalities, so this is something I think we need to talk about in greater depth as we go on throughout the budget. But with interest rates possibly rising, with economic instability possibly next year or two, I don't want to be stuck short in our rate stabilization fund for funds that we really need to carry on the business of running the corporation, and having to put stuff off into future years. So I just wanted to ask that question about, there is consequences, potential consequences if we do this and we get caught. So I just want everybody to be aware of that. So thank you very much thanks.
If I may, Mayor, just to add additional context around the transparency to the public around the GRS reserve. And the Treasurer highlighted it earlier. With the 3% infrastructure levies and other reserve contributions built into the base. And so, year 1, 2, 3, 4, before you know it, it's about 90 million, 100 million in the base directly into the reserves. And so the GRS policy says it's a percentage of the base, basically, or your overall expenditures. So you have 100 million coming off the base directly into reserve pot, and then your GRS says add another 10 million based on that reserve contribution into the. So at minimum, this highlights that transparency that we're not charging for reserves on top of reserves. And so I think that's an important part of the discussion here as well. I just wanted to flag that piece. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, can I just respond? Thanks, Mr. CEO. I understand that. But in the greatest of transparency as well, you know, we need to be very transparent and say any extra money that's left over from budgets that we haven't spent in previous 12 months go into the rate stabilization fund. So, you know, if we've got $5 million left over because of budgetary savings, because we hired people and we didn't start people until, you know, 6 months later, that also goes into that fund. So I think, you know, if we're gonna be totally open and transparent, everybody needs to know where that money comes from as well. So, but thank you very much for that, Mr. CEO. Thanks.
Maybe I could just add to that. So we wouldn't be recommending necessarily a change to our budget policy pertaining to how we handle surplus funds. Obviously, at the end of every year, council can decide to make recommendations that maybe reallocate those funds in a different manner. But the current policy and what we're still recommending that we keep as the policy is that the surplus first go to top up the reserve, the GRS reserve, to the target rate, which we're now proposing as a revised target rate. And then secondly, that it would go to capital repair and replacement.
Yeah, just quickly through you, Mr. Mayor. Dave, you mentioned that the stormwater surcharge was going to go into the rate stabilization. Did I hear that wrong?
Yeah, through the chair. So there will be a new reserve established for the stormwater fee, and that fee is collected on the regional water bill. The region will then send the money to us, and then that funds capital projects as well as some of our operating projects tied to stormwater.
Okay, so it'll specifically go to the stormwater. Okay.
It's a dedicated source strictly for stormwater management.
Okay, great, thank you.
I've got a few questions now myself. Thank you for all the great questions, members of council. First question on the stormwater management item that Council Williams just brought up again. This is a significant allocation of funds that we're doing, looking out for challenges that may present itself in the future. So how many million is it again a year?
It's about $22 million.
$22 million. So in the context of a tax increase, what would that be?
I believe it's about 6%
Yeah.
or so.
4.5, right? It's 5 million in tax.
Yeah,
So a little bit over 4. So that's significant. We're setting aside 4% and saying this is for the future, and this is something new, isn't it?
That's correct.
Okay. So it shows that this council, in terms of preparing for the future, preparing for that volatile environment, has taken an important step that doesn't come inexpensively. This is, we're asking our residents to make a significant contribution, and I think it's a smart one. If you look at the challenges around climate change and challenges and pressures on our infrastructure, I think it's a smart decision. I just want to highlight the significance of that contribution. I was on a 10-10 radio panel a few months ago, and the mayor of Toronto was talking about this, Toronto was going to bring in a transit levy, and it was significant that their municipality was taking that step. But we have a transit and an infrastructure levy, the 1% and the 2%. Are there any other municipalities that you know of that have both a transit and an infrastructure levy to this extent?
I'm not, through you, Chair, I'm not aware of any other municipality at this point that has a transit levy. I'm not sure if Alex is aware of any that have transit levies.
Maybe Alex wants to chime in here.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any ones locally. I know in jurisdictions in Nova Scotia, like Halifax, for example, they do have transit levies, depending on the proximity of how close you live to a stop. But there may be something that we can look into and get back to you.
Well, you know, it would be great to see a chart on that for council. It shows when the public's saying, you know, are you making the appropriate preparations? Are you saving in terms of our aspirations? Because we want to have great infrastructure, we want to have great transit, and that costs funds. We talk about an electric bus pilot, and what if we wanted to do that across the city? Obviously, that's going to have a cost. It'd change how we'd even have our transit facilities in terms of storage. And so I think it's important for council and the public to know that the levy is something unique, and the fact that Toronto is following that example shows that we're ahead of the curve on this. Think about that. There's no other municipalities doing both, and maybe outside of Ontario, but I think that's showing forward planning by this council. In terms of the reserves, because Councillor Bowman mentioned that, I know you said this in your presentation, but where do the reserves currently stand?
Through the chair, so we have $195 million in obligatory reserves, so development charges, cash in lieu of parkland, building rate stabilization, development charges, so on, and about $285 million in discretionary reserves. So that includes our legacy fund, our community investment fund, our general rate stabilization reserve, and then there's some other balances there. We do have some other.
So close to 500 million.
Correct.
And how do we compare to other municipalities in terms of the health of our reserves?
Through the chair, I think, I don't know specifically each of the dollars, but I would say we're in good shape compared to our peers.
And I remember my update last year highlighted that we're in a very strong position compared to other municipalities in terms of the fact that we've taken the time to year after year and previous councils to understand there's a responsibility there to invest in the reserves. And so the fact that that's healthy. I would say, I know sometimes we talk about the year-end funds and how we continue to run surpluses each year. It's not our funds. If we run a surplus, it means we charge the taxpayer too much. I want us to lose the mentality that if we charge too much, that we just find something to spend it on, or we hold the money ourselves. It's not our funds. It's the public's, and I just think that's an important context to think of. When I see a big surplus at the end of the year, I feel bad that we took too much from the public and took too much from property taxpayers. The last thing I wanted to get some clarification on is there was an online article from a local newspaper that said this budget contained a series of cuts, maybe to the CEO. Are there any cuts in this budget that you're aware of?
Thank you, Mayor. If I want to comment on the reserve conversation first, then answer your question. The other component that doesn't often get talked about when you talk about reserves is the reserve debt ratio, but as well, I highlighted in my slide deck, the deferred revenue. So on top of the almost 500 million in reserves, there's 300 million in deferred revenue that is coming to the city as well. So I think that's part of the story with respect to the reserves that, quite frankly, I'd say we're in great shape on that front. On the question with respect to any cuts, the short answer is no. This budget is maintained or enhanced service levels across the corporation, across the board. The one exception that I would bring forward is an efficiency identified through the operational review on grass cutting, going from 12 cuts a year to 10 cuts a year. And so that's comparable to all of our neighboring municipalities, and that was suggested through the operational review. In terms of grass grows the same across the street in Mississauga as it does in Brampton. And so we budgeted for 10 cuts this year instead of 12 grass cutting. And that's the only exception. And I would say that's an optimization piece that's in line with our neighboring municipalities. I hope that helps.
And is that your assessment too, that there's the article that referenced cuts, there are no cuts other than optimizing to have the same grass cutting standard as they do in Mississauga and Toronto, et cetera?
That is correct.
Okay.
I believe the article also spoke to capital budgeting, and as I mentioned in my presentation, in fact, from a property tax standpoint, we're investing $12 million more this year in property tax funded projects than we had forecast last year for this year.
Okay. Well, I think that's very important. If anyone got a question about that, it shows it's very important to have accurate facts, and thank you for clarifying that. I see there's two more questions on the board, so we'll go back to the board. Councillor Fatimi.
Thank you. On the grass cutting, that's one thing we get a lot of complaints on. And if you look at other municipalities, they don't have a lot of green space like us. And when you see all this stuff growing, we're the first ones who get the complaints. 2 cuts, does it make that much of a difference?
Through the chair, through our research, we have, with the benchmarking, we found that yes, it does make the difference, the 2 cuts. We have so much of parkland and all the areas. If we don't do the two
mulch.
cuts.
But grass, it grows a certain time, and when it's a dry season, it doesn't cut, so can't we move it around?
Through the chair, I think it's really an again, it's a bit of it's alignment with our pure municipalities, but it's also a bit of an optimization. I think what you're getting to with your point is, the grass is really not growing too much in the middle of the summer, and we're really talking about reducing those cuts during the middle of summer when it's not growing at all. Our budget would reflect the amount of parkland and boulevards and so on that need cuts compared to our other municipalities. So the reduction in the budget for this to align with our peers is just a reflective of our cost to cut at a certain rate across the city.
Because our parks are used a lot, and when you see the grass is long, that's where we get it all the time. What about my other question, on trails? I thought a lot of these trails going from parks to schools, we were supposed to clean the snow. We keep cutting every year. A lot of students cut through those areas to go to school. And we gotta keep those.
Through the chair, as far as I'm sure, I know that this budget does not include any reduction in service levels tied to trail maintenance in the winter.
For the winter, okay.
Yeah, and just a clarification on that, Councilor Bertini, there was a recommendation from one of the service reviews that recommended that, but it did not make the budget. And so I know we received emails about maintaining clear trails, and I think it's pretty clear, and I know our CEO has heard it, that this council is a big supporter of active transportation. If anything, we want to make it easier to get out and ride a bike and run and be active. And so that's not in the budget, and if it was, I know there'd be an amendment to change it right away. You can count on this council to continue to push active transportation, and that means clean trails.
Yeah, and I'm just worried more the students going to school in the winter. They gotta do, school bus have a certain area, you gotta go, so for them to get to schools, it's a shorter cut to go through the trails, through our parks, and end up at school instead of going all the way around. That's all I worry, those ones, I'm not saying everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Councilor Bertini. Councilor Singh.
Yeah, how much of a surplus are we saying we're looking at from last year's budget?
Through the chair, so the report that's on the agenda for later in deliberations indicates almost $16 million, just over $15 million in surplus. Staff are currently working through the numbers right now to determine what the unaudited final year figures are. We're still not quite sure as of today what that number will land at, but we're hoping to have more answers for you by the time we get to that report on the agenda on Thursday.
Okay, and how big, these would be through the operating, I'm assuming, right?
Yes, so that would be a one-time operating surplus. Any adjustments to either expenditures or revenues going forward, we would have made that in this budget, which would have helped keep pressure down in this 2020 budget request.
And how much was the size of the operating budget last year around? Was it over 700 or?
Yeah, it was just over 700.
700, okay. Trying to see as a percentage what we're looking at around. Because there's, we just got to be cautious. There's always going to be a margin of error, where we have projected and forecasted and actuals. And it could have been just as well on the other side. So, we should be cautious of, saying that, we took extra. It could have been where we would have had to put extra pressures on this year to cover up for something last year. And I've been in that situation at the school board, and it's not funny. It's not a good situation. So the other way to look at this story of surpluses is, we worked hard. We delivered at 0% last year. Our staff were able to beat forecasts again, and that's really a good story. And hopefully we can continue that. But I don't know if I agree with the angle that we took from the taxpayers, because it's how you see this. I see this as a good news story, to be honest.
Thank you, Councillor Singh. In terms of the last number of years, I know we have run surpluses pretty continuously. Has there been a year in the last 10 years where we actually ran a $15 million deficit?
Through the chair, so there years back in 2009, 2010, I believe, when we went through the recession,
Global economic
we were
slowdown.
drawing out of our reserves to offset
Yeah.
frontline services.
But in the last 10 years, there hasn't been an occasion?
No.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Medeiros.
Thank you, through the mayor. I guess not to belabor the point, we talked about there's no service reductions, and I know we're doing a KPMG service audit, not just KPMG, other consultants. So the fact that we're not doing any service cuts doesn't give me the confidence that it's almost basically saying that the services that we do offer are good services. And not to single out one service, I'm hoping that there are services that, I don't want to use the word cut, but maybe phase out or look at how we do that service differently. So the fact that there's nothing on the line doesn't predispose the fact that there's many business lines that we're into that I wouldn't agree that they should stick with us. So I think, again, that's a premature conversation because I know there's a lot of work going on that's going to help maybe with next year's budget. So this year's budget really stay the course, good management. So I'm good with that. I guess regarding the levies, I do, part of when we doubled the infrastructure levy and also the transit, when we introduced the transit levy, really you have not only a signal to the community that we take those areas important, we think they're important, it's also that transparency that we're dedicating that source and not putting back to general revenue, then it gets pulled out to other areas. So, I'm really supportive of that. And I just, I recognize the great work all staff have done, our new CAO and everyone's has rolled up their sleeves to ensure that, we're maintaining this sound fiscal management. And, but I do want to see that conversation because I still do feel that we're stretched in areas where I'm not necessarily confident that we should be. One of the interesting things when you talk about some of the provincial cuts and the impacts on us, when I hear a premier talk about, finding efficiencies, forcing everyone to find efficiencies. So we're just making up all these gaps that the province have put onto us. And we really haven't started looking into even our own business and finding those efficiencies, whatever that terminology is. So anyways, I think it is a good story. It's a continuous for making those sound investments. But I still think that we have to look at also leveraging our relationship with the regional region appeal in terms of are there business areas in which that we can leverage and maybe not necessarily work with them. Active transportation's an area. Do we have to put in so much if we're already collecting and the region's putting so much? I'm not saying there is an answer, but those are areas of collaboration where we can try to look for those offsets. But other than that, look forward to further continuous conversations, and I thank staff for all their work.
Thank you, Councilor Medeiros. Councilor Vicente.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question through to the Treasurer. In your presentation, you talked about the value of building permits and how they have been lower in past years. I know we had an update from our chief building official just last week that the value of permits that have been issued year to date in 2019 have been up quite substantially. Can you just comment on what effect that has on the remainder of the budget for this year and for next year, and how that may impact our future budgets if that trend were to continue?
Through the chair, so it does impact the budget in a number of ways, but there's a bit of a lag in terms of the timing at which you issue a permit, the home has to get built, and then the people move in, occupy, and then start demanding service. At which time then the city starts to see the increase in terms of the assessment growth that comes in to fund those requirements or those additional demands on our services. So there's about a 2-year lag, I would say, approximately. It's not perfect science, but there's about a two-year lag between when a permit's issued before the property is then added to the assessment roll and the people are moving into those properties. You're correct. There has been, so we saw a downturn, but we are starting to turn back up again. And so there would be a further 2-year lag in terms of future years where demands on services would then begin to increase again. However, there would be additional assessment growth also coming in to help offset those increases.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, from what we know of this year, we're only into February, but has the trend that we saw last year with that strong demand for construction permits, are we seeing that same strong demand this year as well?
Through the chair, I think I will have to pass this off to Richard.
Through the chair, we have, we're just getting our data now to be able to assess what's happening in January with respect to the numbers, so we can report back to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
You've finished, Councillor? Was it Councillor Pelosi?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. When we're talking about the permitting and the permitting system, is it defined anywhere as to the permits for renovations as opposed to permits for new builds? And is the uptick right now because of those renovation permits, and not necessarily new home builds? Hey, Rick.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor, we do, all of our statistics do define a difference between what was issued for new residential versus renovations. So we can certainly bring those numbers back for you to look at. They are included in the 2019 year-end report. I think page 3 of that report will identify all of the separate categories. The one thing I did want to highlight is that half of the new dwelling units that were issued last year were new dwelling units constructed as secondary units. So when we speak to assessment growth, when you see growth in those secondary units, you don't get the assessment that you would typically get with growth of a new single or semi or townhouse. So that's something that maybe council will want to keep in mind because certainly we saw 3,100 applications come in last year for second units. The assessment growth for second units is very limited.
Okay, so Rick, I'm going to ask a question that I kind of ask every year. So what I'd like to know is, based on our forecast that we forecasted over every year for future years, in terms of building permits come in for new development, I'd like it separated in terms of new development building permits and where we forecasted, renovation permits and where we forecasted. If you can separate, you'll be able to separate new build and the renovations, but I don't know, what about the forecast? Can you separate that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes. Our forecasted revenue is broken out in the same manner, so okay. I can give you that.
And then additionally, the commercial.
Correct.
Industrial, and so on.
I can give you all of those categories.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And then also mentioning in there, I'd like to see, so I don't have to actually do the numbers, but the DC relating to each.
I'll have to work with
what we forecasted and okay. Accurate development charges.
Okay. I can work with Janet to get that information as well.
Please. Thank you.
And I would just note to council, we are going to have departmental presentations. We'll have an opportunity to ask specific questions like this throughout the week.
That's what I'm looking forward to come back in that departmental. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you for all the questions. I have a motion. Forum Research is unavailable to be here today because of a scheduling conflict. So we have a motion prepared by Charlotte to defer the presentation until tomorrow's session of Budget Committee. Can I have a motion? Councillor Willen, seconded by Councillor Medeiros. All those in favor? Motion carries. Okay, that takes us to item 4.3, and just to let everyone know, we do have scheduled today from 1 to 4, so we're going to try to get as much in today as we can in that period. And we have blocks of time, once again, set out throughout the week to make our way through this agenda. You look at the agenda, it's obviously much longer than the time we have allocated today. That's why we have a number of days allocated for budget. So our next item is the presentation from Alan Mitchell and Steve Batty of KPMG regarding the Operational Service Review, Consolidation, Business Improvement, and Prioritization. After the presentation, committee can then ask questions. Welcome, Alan and Steve.
And members of the public, thank you very much for the opportunity to make this presentation. I'm CP. I chair KPMG's Global Cities business. And Alan was the leader of our, or has been the leader of our work to date. A couple of things I'd just like to say right off the top. Our work to date has focused on the 2020 budget year rather than things in the future. This is things that have implication for this year's budget for you. We considered alignment with council priorities, the impact on environmental sustainability, and then focused on the budget. We've received very good cooperation from staff as well as cooperation from the consultants who did the work. Open, honest, and fulsome responses to every question that we have been asked. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to step back and I'm going to let Alan, who led the work, talk, and then we'll be back for questions at the end. Alan.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Mayor and councillors, for having us here today. On this slide, this is a slide that shows the 7 operational service reviews. One for governance and internal services done by Ernst & Young that identified 13 initiatives. One for public works and engineering, again, Ernst & Young, 17 initiatives. Fire and emergency services, Ernst & Young, 5 initiatives. Brampton Library, Ernst & Young, 5 initiatives. Community services was Blackline Consulting, and there they actually identified 20 different initiatives. The 6th one was economic development and culture. That was Optimus SBR, 10 initiatives. And finally, Brampton Transit, Optimus SBR, 11 initiatives. Right out of the gate, when you take a look at this, the first thing that we noticed is that this was, in fact, departmental reviews or organizational reviews. And wouldn't it be great if all the services aligned with each of the respective departments? But that remains to be seen, and so we kept our eye open for that particular observation. The second thing that we noticed when we dug into each of these studies was different methodologies and approaches, different ways in which they calculated the financials, the financial implications, and so on. And so we needed to weave our way through all these different methodologies and approaches and try to analyze all 81 of these service improvement initiatives in a consistent manner. We actually decided to divide the initiatives into 3 different categories. Those that we thought would have immediate budget 2020 implications, of which we determined there were 13. Those that we felt were continuous improvement initiatives. In other words, just do it. We didn't see the need necessarily to make a big thing out of these particular initiatives, although it might be important for that department. But just get on with it. And then the 3rd category was initiatives requiring further review. So when we took a look at some of the financials, and we dug fairly deeply into the financials, we challenged some of the numbers, and when we did challenge those numbers, we felt that some of these initiatives didn't make financial sense but needed to have further elaboration, further due diligence done to get to the bottom of it. In total, 81. We are not suggesting that any one of these initiatives not proceed. What we're suggesting with the budget 2020 is you may need to put some money aside, or you may receive cost savings or revenue increases as a result of those initiatives that might make it worthwhile proceeding with those 13 initiatives. The continuous improvement, we see those going forward by definition. Nothing should stand in the way of those. And then the 3rd one, we need to dig a little bit deeper and find out what makes sense to proceed and maybe add it into the 2021 budget. Sorry about the size of this, I apologize, but here are the 13. Essentially, what we did is we chalked up what was the operating capital and total budget request for 2020. And so for the operating budget request, we see something in the order of $10,000. We see capital requests in the order of $290,000 for a total of $300,000 for operating in capital in 2020. And you can see the individual items of the 13 that are requested there. Some people have suggested that, wait a minute, number 5, develop a new facilities master plan for the library, doesn't make sense. Libraries are not building new branches anymore, or if they are, there's a great deal of scrutiny. We're talking there in our minds about a study that takes a look at those facilities and said, are there opportunities with existing facilities in the city to maybe leverage those facilities and have greater utilization of those facilities by putting a library branch into them? It does two things. It increases facility utilization, but it also increases access to the library in different parts of the city. My colleague Steve and I have been trying to promote the concept of community hubs, or islands of good as we call them, where in fact we have one facility that offers many different services. And it's centrally located or at specific strategic locations so that it's constantly being busy. I live in Etobicoke, and nothing disturbs me more than driving down the street and seeing a school that's empty during the summer, a library that's empty most of the day, community centers that are not all that utilized during the day, and then at night overutilized. And so when I go down and see these individual facilities being underutilized, that really burns me as a taxpayer. Anyway, here are the 13. That's not much of a budget request, whether you're talking operating or capital for fiscal 2020. What we did is we took a look at the net cash flow, which is, okay, what's the total operating and capital? Here we're talking 270 to 295 million in request, but with revenue of 1.4 to 2.1 million for a net cash flow of 1.1 million to 1.8 million. In other words, by proceeding with these 13 initiatives, you're actually saving money or increasing revenue to the amount of 1.1 or 1.8 million. Okay, that's over and above the cost of actually implementing them. Okay. Not all of these initiatives actually have operating and capital requests or cost savings attached to them, which begs the question, why would you proceed with those? But in our mind, we felt that there was nothing standing in the way of those perhaps offering up process improvements to help the public, the effectiveness side of the equation. And when we look at services, we're looking at the balance between efficiency, which is the cost, versus the effectiveness, which is the value proposition that the service offers. Okay. And so some of these initiatives may not show up on a cost or revenue picture, but may have effectiveness improvements. Let's go into the next slide. We then did a net cash flow over the period 2020 to 2026, and there we see something in the order of 25 to 38 million dollars in cumulative savings over that 7-year period, excuse me. And here are the actual numbers that we're starting to see that may emerge, where we would finish off at a roughly 6.1 million in additional revenue or cost savings per annum starting in 2025. So some of these improvements, they're phased in, where some of the revenue improvements or some of the cost savings would be phased in with the efforts that are done on that particular initiative. So we categorize 29 initiatives as continuous improvement. I've just finished talking about those that are part of the 2020 budget, but on the 29 that are continuous improvement, several of the initiatives are simply good management practices that arguably should already be in place, or the required effort to implement should be low to modest. And to give you an example, there was a suggestion in one of the reports for the Economic Development Group to develop a work plan and performance measurements so that they could begin to monitor those over time. We absolutely agree that that should be happening, but we don't see that necessarily as something that needs that much approval. It just seems like good management practice to proceed with that. So that's 29 different initiatives. When it comes to the initiatives requiring further review or further due diligence, we had 39 initiatives that fell into that category. And so here we're talking about a reassessment of the scope that may apply to that particular initiative, a refinement of the business case, or a re-examination of the merits of whether that initiative should proceed or not. Okay. So to give you an example of an initiative that would fall into this category, we looked at one initiative. It was originally going to be part of the 2020 budget, which was to hire an additional 10 to 15 operators, transit operators, for the transit service. And one of the issues that came up in looking further at the details was that the rationale for doing this was based on savings from overtime. And what we couldn't justify was the actual number that was used for overtime, or whether or not the individual operators being hired would have that direct or an indirect impact on overtime. We simply said, let's stand back, look more closely at it, and we may still proceed with that, but with further detail behind that. Because these were individual organizational reviews, we were concerned that we might see or not see systemic issues resolved. And so what we thought at the end of the day is we would offer up what we thought might be good initiatives to pursue that would be good for the corporation at large. And so we put two forward. There may be others, but given the short 6-week time frame that we did this, we came up with the following. One is the centralized oversight function to oversee implementation of the initiatives. And there, I've listened to council speak today about moving forward on the council priorities or resident priorities. Totally agree. But many of those council priorities or resident priorities are already in the stack of work that's being commissioned right now. And what we need is to track those to see that we're actually achieving the overall goal or outcome that we're trying to achieve. And so I completely agree on that. We need to be directly accountable for those Budget 2020 initiatives to make sure that they happen in 2020 so that we can start to see the savings, or we can start to see the revenue improvements that we've actually stated we will achieve. And by the way, all the revenue numbers, the cost numbers, et cetera, were provided to us by the consulting firms, not by KPMG. So we think that the consulting firms did their work given the terms of reference they were given, but their numbers are the numbers that show up here. Okay. Third category is monitoring the continuous improvement initiatives. Many of them like just get on with it. Let's make sure that we just get on with it. And the final one is for those that require additional oversight, make sure that we do that due diligence, come up with that additional, let's say, business case that would make that particular initiative sing and dance and actually move it forward, and then proceed with that in next year's budget. So that's that centralized oversight function to oversee the implementation of these many initiatives from a corporate perspective. The second one is a service inventory of public and internal services. And one of my specialties, and I'm not suggesting I would help the city do this, but one of the things that I've been helping cities do across Canada, if not around the world, is to rediscover their services. And you may think that's a rather glib comment, but we've lost touch with our services. So I heard today 3 different ways of describing stormwater drainage as a service. Okay. All of them completely valid. But what are the list of our public and internal services? How much does it cost for each of our services? Not the department or the division that may be running that service. How much does it cost for that service? What's the unit cost for a building permit? What's the unit cost for a lane kilometer of road, operating and capital? And once we have that inventory of services, public and internal, then we can start to align our performance indicators. We can start to do deeper dives in terms of service improvements. And if anybody ever says that this particular service doesn't need to be improved, I would argue. We are seeing dramatic changes around the world in the way that people are delivering their services. So you've talked today about street lighting with LED lights, and that the business case typically is a 1.5-year return on investment. We're watching that at KPMG, looking at that and seeing here's a different way of providing that service. And for each service, there are creative ways that you could deliver it better. So don't think for a moment that just because we're probably top of the heap when it comes to our peers in the industry, that we should stop looking for innovation. Clearly, that's not the answer. We need to continuously look for improvements. So the last piece there is to put together that service inventory of public and internal services. And with that, what I'll do is I'll open up to questions.
Thank you very much. Councillor Santos, you're on the board.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. Just a couple of questions about the recommendation for reduced grass cutting schedule. We hear from many residents, especially in the summer, that the grass cutting isn't actually enough. And when I spoke to staff earlier about this today, they had mentioned that it's not necessarily reducing grass cutting across the board, it's just being more strategic of where to grass cut. So I'm wondering if you could share that, elaborate on that.
Right, so when it comes to grass cutting, there are a couple of different initiatives that come into play here. One is, why do we have this extensive park system that nobody uses 40% of the park, but we always cut the grass to the same spec as the rest of the park? Why don't we turn some of that back over into open space that is, in terms of the environment, helping its sustainability, but also reducing the cost? And then there are portions of the park that require more grass cutting than others. So when it comes to baseball diamonds, there are standards that we have to live up to, or with cricket fields, et cetera. And so we need to live up to those standards. The question then becomes, what do we do with that residual park space, and how frequently do we cut it, and to what length? And so those things, what we're doing here is we're taking the recommendations from this particular studies on grass cutting and moving forward with that suggestion for Budget 2020.
Thank you. And then I think the mayor and other folks had already shared my concerns around the active transportation winter maintenance thing, so I definitely wouldn't bring that forward, that's for sure. It's contrary to the complaints, or the second most problematic area for residents in the previous survey around traffic and congestion. Years after years of building many, many roads in Brampton, we have increased traffic and congestion, so there is something wrong with the formula we're using in terms of moving people around, and I think active transportation has a lot to do with solving some of those problems. My other question is just about methodology. There's a lot of, how is this different from the recommendations brought forward from the other consultants? And also, there's a lot in here about, further review. What does that mean?
Okay, so through the chair, our methodology was to synthesize all of the studies and use a framework where we could actually assess the strengths and the weaknesses being proposed in each of the initiatives. So when we look at a strength, what is the financial benefit of that particular initiative? Were there cost savings? Was there an improvement in customer service? Was there an alignment with your strategic priorities, council priorities? Those were positive things. We also looked at the risks and the negative factors. So what would the cost of implementing this be? Not the same thing as how much would it save us, but how much would it cost us? The other was the risk of failure. There might have been technology hurdles thrown at us, et cetera, et cetera. So we looked at 10 different factors, 5 positive and 5 negative, to come up with an evaluation matrix, but basically used the information from the studies themselves and relied heavily on the structure of those studies that were different to come up with our evaluation of the 10 characteristics.
Okay. And further review, what is that?
So further review is, I mentioned the example of transit, and I'm not trying to pick on the transit folks at all, but if I were to look at the overtime and to get the amount, I believe it's over 6 million that was quoted in the report, and we could get a better handle on whether adding one new bus operator or transit operator made what kind of difference to the overtime, then we'd feel more confident that putting more money into transit operators would make sense. We don't have that at our fingertips, not in a 6-week period. So what we suggest is, after this, these recommendations or suggestions go forward, what you would do is actually dig deeper into finding out about these specific initiatives, to clarify scope, to clarify some of the financials, and then based on that revision and those finer examinations, decide whether to proceed or not.
Great. And you alluded to it a little bit in terms of the cross-departmental collaboration on key priorities for the city, because from my understanding, the consultants, including yourselves, your focus was more specific to a departmental service review than it was looking at the overall picture and how we deliver ultimately the services to the resident themselves in the most efficient and effective way. So you touched on it a little bit. Does that need further review, or?
Through the chair, the suggestion that we have to put together your service inventory is perhaps the most blatant response to that. In terms of, show me your services, show me how this particular initiative is going to affect that service, that really tightens things up. We don't have the service inventory, and we don't have its specific connection to the initiatives. But if we did have those two, and we were to connect them, then we'd see the impact on efficiency and or effectiveness and make better decisions moving forward.
Alan, it allows you to cut across departments. So where 4 or 5 departments are involved with the delivery of a service or contribute to the cost of the delivery of the service, it'll actually allow you to do that. 3 years ago, we did a survey. We asked 400 different municipalities to give us one efficiency measure and one effectiveness measure across their services. 400 municipalities indicated an interest in proceeding. By the time we were done, only 37 were actually able to give us good data, or data they felt comfortable providing us. The insights that you would receive from something like this, I think, would change how you're able to discharge your responsibilities to the public. It really will lay open the needs and the ability to deliver this. Your current model tracks expenditures very well. What it doesn't say is how much does it cost me to pick up a bag of garbage or to show up at a fire. It doesn't show you that. And in order to be able to decide what the appropriate service levels are, that would be very useful information. You've still got information, but it's far more judgmental than a full cross-cutting approach to services would be.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much for coming today. I guess I have to go back to the grass cutting, and it's easy for us to pick on grass at the point of the season that we're in, and we tend to do that, and then vice versa for the winter in the summer months. So grass cutting here at the city has come a long way in the last 5 years, where we've renaturalized a lot of the areas in Brampton. So I guess kind of what I'm hearing is re-looking at some other areas for potential to renaturalize, and then additionally allow grass to grow a little bit longer in some of the areas that aren't in the high use, but not comparing them to soccer fields or baseball diamonds, other areas of play. Is that right?
So through the chair, the suggestion that we might have is to do that kind of review collaboratively with the local community. So working with the local community and their parks, say, look, we're interested in cutting down the cost of maintaining this park. We're thinking of turning this portion of the park into a naturalized area. Having that dialogue back and forth, I think, would reap some interesting insights that could then be used to inform whether we should be doing it to that extent or maybe even more.
So was there any, an opportunity when you were going through this process and looking at how many areas of Brampton that we have gone through renaturalizing?
No, we simply took the recommendations from the consultants that we were given their studies for. We did sit down with them, we did ask them questions, and again, they were also on a fairly short leash in terms of their studies, but that's a good question and one that I think deserves more fuller attention.
So I guess, and there's an additional questions that if you know, I'm sure somebody from that department would be able to express that the amount of calls that counselors give to them about certain areas, and then on top of that, if we don't get into those areas quick enough, then allergies become an issue where grass is a little bit too long. We haven't picked up the grass because we don't want to pick up the grass. We want it cut and then put back into the ground as compost. But if you allow it to grow a little bit longer, then it's killing grass. So I think it's an easy target, but I don't think that it's there for kind of the pickings or we can take this. It's a difficult one, especially when, you know, we're dealing with a limited amount of time to cut the grass in the spring where it's growing. Like we all have, maybe we don't all, but a lot of people have grass, but in the spring it gets to, I hate cutting my grass twice a week. I just want to put that out there. In the summer, in the dead heat of the summer in August, I'm okay with every 4 weeks. And then winter maintenance on trails, that's another issue that we have when we're promoting active transportation. We have a lot of people that want to run our trails, bike our trails, walk our trails, and then now we're looking at the possibility of reducing that maintenance.
Through the chair, when it comes to active transportation, a lot of people use that term, and in my mind, that's excluding vehicular transportation. That's transit, bicycling, walking. There might be others as well, but those three primarily. I'm not sure if the city has set a target for what they want in terms of each of those different modes, but that would be useful to set. That would set an agenda, and there's also a cost associated with setting that modal split. And so I just put that out there. I understand the need for moving towards those three different modes. Now the question is, what cost do we incur in doing so? And we need to factor that into the decision making as well.
And now this is a perfect example of a service level discussion.
Yep.
And that's exactly what we were talking about. We're talking about the services.
Sure, and when you're talking about active transportation and actually getting from A to B, we definitely need to have that conversation because that looks a little bit different than what we currently have here in the city of Brampton. But when we're talking about our trail network in the city of Brampton, which is a fantastic trail network, and the amount of people that are actually utilizing those, and then we get phone calls to say, hey, you know, these are icy, we need to increase that level of service, then it's another discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councilor Quashie. Councilor Bowman.
Thank you very much through you, Mr. Mayor. Quite a detailed report, gentlemen, very detailed. I've just got a couple of questions. 4.3-11 says, through organizational units appear to be excluded. Strategic Development Unit within CAO, Court Administration, and Purchasing Division within the Corporate Services Department. And on the following page, again, it just says, the scope of the study intentionally excluded 3 divisions as they were already undergoing internal operational reviews and continuous improvement efforts. Have you seen reports from those ongoing efforts?
No, we haven't.
So subsequent reports where it says they were already being worked on and reviewed, there was no subsequent reports submitted to you for your inclusion here?
Through the chair, the 7 studies that we looked at were the context and scope for us. Even though we're aware that there are other studies, and even though we're aware there were departments or divisions that were not part of the operational service reviews.
Okay, so my next question is, I guess, to the CAO, the departmental reviews, are they complete? Because it says here we did not include them in these reviews, so I'm assuming if we were undergoing them, they would be complete by now? Hey, Joe.
Thank you. If I may, through the chair. They were excluded. It's not to, I think it's somewhat inaccurate to say that there were reviews and reports being created or developed. If we look at procurement, for instance, it had gone through a review by the ombudsman, and we responded with to their recommendations. So we transformed that business. We created a new purchasing bylaw. We reorganized how procurement did its work. We reduced a number of the administrivia and red tape associated with how they did their work. So I felt that there wasn't much more to do significantly when there's a number of other areas to focus on and address, hence why they were excluded. With our Provincial Offences Court, again, it was constructive mechanisms to address how they delivered their services, doing more with the same resources by rejigging the job descriptions and merging both our in-court and our admin staff to have the same job description, gave us flexibility and the ability to continue to grow by having a pool of resources to be able to do the same resources. It's a small team. The revenue that it's generating and maintaining is growing year after year. There's significant pressures they're facing with our courts. It's not to say we don't have the capacity, it's needing more JPs that we talked about. But again, it's transformed as much as it can for such a small team. So again, from a cost-benefit perspective, it was suggested to be removed. And strategic development, that was a different team. Significant changes have happened in that area, so it wasn't fair, especially there's a number of new staff coming in there. I believe that the CAO will, in fact, have some ideas on what it wants to do with that area moving forward.
Okay, yeah, no, my whole point was, is there more information that we as a budget committee should be receiving to make decisions on if there was ongoing improvement processes in those areas, that's all. So no reason, David, if it's there, it's there. But I just want to know, we need all the information that we can get to make the decisions we need to make. So if there was anything that we don't have, it would have been good to have it in future meetings, I guess.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. So you have all the information. It's important that you have all the information to make your decisions, and certainly as it impacts and relates to the 2020 budget process. I just want to reiterate that KPMG's review of the 7, if you think back to, I believe, last summer, when the other various consultants that were identified here, Blackline, Optimus, and Ernst & Young, they presented exactly what their work plans were. They were approved by council, and council added KPMG to view it. So they're, everyone's following exactly that council resolution. Internally, staff are always looking at improvements, and I think those processes were kind of going pre, during, and or after, so those are kind of regular course of business, as the Commissioner highlighted. Anything coming forward with respect to resource implications, operational implications, efficiency implications would come forward.
Okay, because the Blackline Consulting also did not do on a realty service or building design. So again, there's nothing new we need to know from either of those.
The exception would be that council passed the resolution to explore a municipal development corporation model. So that's currently underway.
Okay, so we've got a recommendation for service improvement, and it just says by law enforcement and animal services realignment. What sort of, can we talk about that? What sort of realignment that you might have been suggesting there?
So through the chair, I believe the suggestion was regarding licenses. Both bylaw enforcement and animal services offer up licenses, and there was an opportunity to bring that closer together so that the common person in the street, who I refer to as TC Pits, actually can go to a City of Brampton website and apply for an animal service license or a bylaw enforcement license in the same location and be treated the same way. So that's what the convergence was. I may be wrong, but that's the way I interpret it.
So you mean like an app, for instance?
Well, that's certainly one of the ways of doing it, but at least at the beginning, one of the key elements is to bring the processes more closely together and those people that deliver those services together so that we can deliver it in a similar, if not the same fashion across the board. That applies to all licenses, by the way.
Okay, so do you have any comment on if, as single units or as a whole right now, if we are delivering the opportunity to buy permits and licenses online is acceptable to residents, or if it needs improvement?
So through the chair, what I find is there are different clients out there who have a propensity to want to interact and transact business electronically. I think that percentage is growing year after year. And when we look at it from a city cost perspective, if we can move more of our transactions from, over-the-counter staff to electronic transactions, there's a tremendous business case for moving that forward.
Absolutely agree. Thank you very much.
Councillor Fortini.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to go back to the grass. So we have a bylaw on our height of our grass, and now we're going to cut it to 10. So I've been here 5 years, and every year, our parks are getting worse and worse, and we're going to cut again. So I want to know, what is the savings on those 2 cuts? Because we have a lot of residents that back into parks. We used to cut the grass 8 feet behind the fences. We're not even doing that no more. And there's a lot of parks around the trails we used to cut 8 feet on each side. We're not doing that no more. Now we're going to cut more again on the grasses. Those are the #1 complaints we get when all these seniors are using these parks and have events and the grass is this long, when we have a bylaw and we go put notices on people's houses. So the consultants that do this, they have to look at how the parks are being used. Our seniors use it every day, and that's the #1 thing. And even now with 12 cuts, we're getting complaints. You want to bring it to 10, April, you got to cut the grass at least once a week. April, May, in the growing season. We're going to wait 15 days. Where by the time you cut it, right now, when you go in these parks, it looks like you're baling hay because it's so long. No, we're going to extend it more. Right? So I want to know what the savings is of these 2 cuts are.
So it's $480,000 savings. It's about $240,000 per cut.
So we can manage to find it somewhere else. I don't want to cut the grass. I get lots of complaints on the grass. Lots. On the boulevards, I got pictures from last year, grass this long. On the boulevards, they were like that, all over the place. And it's getting worse and worse every year. And I've been here 5 years. Now we're going to cut it down. I can't accept on the 2 cuts cut. I know we're going to get blasted with the seniors calling, people playing sports, they can't even go in there. And like Councilor Palacio said, allergies is the #1 thing on that. And I know the dandelions, they grow overnight, but still, they look at it and says, look at our parks. It's a mess.
Through the mayor, if I might just comment, having this discussion about the service levels, I totally agree. I've already mentioned that I think getting the community involved in those discussions is important. Who sets the standard for cutting grass? Is it the people that cut the grass, or is it the people that want the grass cut? And so that's a question I throw back that say, in order to resolve this to the satisfaction of your customers, the park users, why not engage them in that? Why not have that conversation and maybe put that to rest? However, at the end of the day, there will always be people that complain about the grass not being maintained to the level that you want.
No, and absolutely, I agree. But I was hoping to add 2 cuts, not to remove them.
Okay. So this is a perfect example of that service level debate, and it's actually a relatively simple one to have, and it's obviously one that's top of mind. So that's a really good example of where you could have this and start that process.
Our parks, compared to other cities, are really, really used here. Every night you go around, you find seniors and kids, they're full. There's the #1 thing that's being used, people on the trails. And I know the trails, when I first started 5 years ago, they were cut on 8 feet. They were cut up to the fences in the backyards. Now people complain, how am I going to get my lawnmower there? It doesn't look good. So at least now we cut those. Some of the parks, the greenfield or naturalized, we're bringing it further. We're bringing it right to the road now. Now, all the garbage is piled up there. It doesn't look nice. So I was hoping to add 2 cuts, not remove 2 cuts. And I talked about it last year, and I talked to staff, especially in the backyards where the fences are. You know, and they have nice homes, like I know, like, now we got that Riverstone Park all along there. That's all naturalized. Used to be a beautiful golf course, and they used to cut it. Now we're leaving it naturalized. We're gonna have more people complaining over there. And we said to them, next year when we get possession, we're gonna cut. Now we're saying no. So we maybe see where we can find that for $500,000 to cut, but not to cut the parks. Can't do that. I can't accept it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I didn't want to get pulled into the grass cutting conversation. Maybe it's not how many cuts we're doing, it's the quality of the cuts, right? So I'll just leave it at that. What concerns me when you see your presentation, so it's interesting you talked about the cost of the service. So what's the real cost of the service? And when you look at, you factor everything out, because we make decisions on basically department needs staff, they need these resources, we go to our residents and so on. But what is that real cost of the service? And that's always that, you know, that it's an interesting conversation. And I thought when previously in our budget, the way we presented our budget was based along the cost of the service. So really, we had that information, I would imagine. I don't know if you want to comment or, because that's the way we presented the last couple of years, was looking at that. So it's interesting when I hear a comment from KPMG, which there are other comments, but it concerns me.
Through the chair, so the way we budget is typically on a gross expenditure basis. We may portray the format that we use to present the budget may change from year to year, but I think what these gentlemen are saying is that you know, is actually a bit of a financial model to determine all of the costs across the corporation that are input into this model to determine the cost to deliver a service, which is what we don't have today.
Yeah, okay, and I guess through the chair, one of the frustrations, just to simplify, not getting into looking at you know, public administration models and so on, that accountability piece here. Okay, so who's overseeing? Where does the buck stop? So we, you know, years ago, and I guess this is previous council, not to get into thing, our whole model was about flattening the organization. So we heard we're flattening, we're gonna be working, breaking down the barriers and breaking down the silos. And then we get to this point, you know, we think we're doing the right decision because everyone and their mother told us, flatten organization, everyone's, you know, drinking from the same Kool-Aid. And then we come here and say no one's, who's on first, who's on second. And we all look at each other going, you know, because we again, and this is a hard conversation to have because there's elephant in the room. We take advice and we get recommendations from our staff. And there's no way I'm going to doubt that staff doesn't do a great job. But we're getting sold a bill of goods here. Because when I go to someone and I say, where's this project? Where's Brampton revitalization happening? Where's this? When we go to people, we get the answer that it's under control. So to sit here and now tell us that one of the main, you know, takeaways is that there's no accountability. Right? Okay, we're addressing it. I know it's a new team and new CEO coming in, new staff. But damn it, like, am I wrong to feel frustrated? Am I wrong to say that everyone I speak with, you know, I have a whole administration. I meet with great talented people. But what the hell is what's the real goods? What's really happening here? Who's responsible? How do I go to my residents, I give them my answers. I believe that, you know, Brampton, the Brampton Downtown Revitalization Project is going to happen on that date. And then after, I don't know what the hell's happening here. So it just makes me question the whole, you know, it puts me on guard that there's a lot of great people I want to have a coffee with, but then I have to start questioning everybody, you know, and like, shame on me for not trusting anyone anymore, because it just seems to be, you know, part of this issue here. And again, I know that I don't want to get into other things, but I have a serious problem if an organization with the amount of budget, with the amount of resources, you know, this council has gone and we've listened to people tell us, this is the right things to do. Here's our recommendations. You know, and sometimes it's difficult to be here and challenge staff. It's difficult sometimes to say, well, you know, it's 100%. You know, they go away, they got a whole department preparing all this information for us, and they come back and they give us, and then we sit here going, what the hell's going on here? So excuse my terminology, but it's just that comment. But the accountability, there has to be this built-in accountability. And ultimately, we're the ones accountable. That's the most frustrating thing, is when I go to Miss Smith's door, she's damn mad as hell, and I'm the one who's responsible. And then I just have everyone shrugging their shoulders. We'll try best, 10 cuts, 14 cuts, 12 cuts. Man, just cut the damn grass and keep it clean, and let's, like that. That's the type of stuff that we want. Excuse my language. The second one is around, in terms of tracking, in terms of the performance indicators. My God, how many times have I sat in this council, and I'm sorry, almost talking about how are we communicating that we're successful, our performance indicators. How do we sit here today and still not understand how are we judging this is good? And I'm not going to go into every department and under service, but we sit here going, how do I communicate to my folks out there that, this is the value for money, this is what we've said we're going to do? I sit there today and I still don't know. I sit there today, it's like we throw numbers on there and we say, okay, we're doing all these things, we're going to create jobs, we're doing this, but those performance indicators, it's almost like, public administration 101. Everywhere, every administration struggles with that. How are we going to clearly communicate these indicators out there? How are we going to evaluate success? It makes it easier for me to communicate to my neighbors. Listen, we promised we would do this, and this is what we're doing. So anyways, this is an aside. It's just frustrating. It's great to validate a lot of things and murmurings that I have with, and it's just interesting because I'm one of the folks that did an MPA, and you go away and you come back and and you sit there. Now I'm in the political side, and you say, well, things are different. I'm going to be driving change and making people accountable and so on. And after you just sit here and frustrated, you just know where to turn anymore. But those are good learnings. I'm sorry for the rant, but essentially there are questions. But it's great to validate where we're going. But the positive news is that we've identified, we've put this stuff out for public discourse, and we know that we are going on a right path. And but it's interesting. I just think, again, this is another sober second thought for our organization. And notwithstanding, and I really believe that we have excellent organization and great staff, and in comparison, I'm proud to say who I'm affiliated with, and maybe that's someone telling me to stop, so I'll leave it there. And I thank you very much for the presentation.
That was just for T. Nico on you. I thank you, Councilor Medeiros, and you're right, we've said this again and again, that we need to look at benchmarking goals. We have this whole 2040 plan. We had the transit discussion last year saying we wanted to have free transit by 2040. What are the stages to that? If we start with seniors, what's the next step and what years? And I think that's a good takeaway from this report, is to make sure that for all the goals we have as a city, what are the benchmarks? How do we self-reflect on the progress we're making? So thanks for reiterating that, Councillor Medeiros. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, through the mayor, and I think that kind of leads into my question around the library. You mentioned earlier about doing like a vision kind of plan for the library. Can you just elaborate on that? Because it sounds like you're really recommending that it be done, and how that is going to really impact communities and help communities.
So through the mayor, the master plan for the library, I think, needs to be done. That's a consulting piece of work. That's why it's probably listed as a capital cost. The point about that is, should we extend the number of branches? So for example, in Toronto has the most number of branches of any library system in the world. I don't know if you realize that. I think there are over 100 branches. Is that the right solution for Brampton? Has anybody actually stood back and said, what is the vision that we have? And by the way, let's say that we want to extend the number of branches by 2 or even 3. Then the question is, how do we do that in the most effective and efficient way possible? Do we have facilities that are underutilized that might very well become candidate sites for a branch? And so that's the kind of thinking that we're talking about in the visioning piece.
Well, I think the other thing is a holistic approach that takes into account all of your service delivery facilities. Clearly not the industrial ones, but the ones where the people are. Factoring that into account will cause, in our view, the right kind of debates to happen about the role of libraries in the community and other citizen delivery services in the community.
It's good to hear, because many do feel like the library is such a safe haven, and it's such a place to feel safe and you get so many supports and resources out of the library, and we do have many different recreation centers that, like you mentioned, could be a good candidate to have a small library location in there. So, you know, looking at the future and planning within the library board, having that discussion around a vision, you know, official plan, something to give the library some direction and where they want to go, I think will be very helpful. So I just thank you for highlighting that, because I think that is some of the grumblings and the conversations that are happening at the library board. So to have that reflected in here is very encouraging and helpful. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Singh?
Yeah, I guess just for clarity's sake, these are just suggestions, right? Like, these are your third-party objective institution, essentially, and you're just giving suggestions. This isn't happening. This is for us to debate and talk about. Like, because I keep hearing people getting very sensitive about certain things, but these are just suggestions, unless I'm missing something.
Through the chair, no, you're not missing anything. And again, we started this beginning of January. We've been through all the reports. We've interviewed everybody. The reason you see so many in that do more work is because there needs to be a whole bunch of clarity around that before you be in a position to have that meaningful debate here.
Yeah, absolutely. And these, maybe through benchmarking and other tools, you were able to come up with these, but obviously our insights are very specific to Brampton, and we'll add another layer to this. But I never took these as, hey, you guys need to do this. I just took it more as, these are suggestions, and do what's best for you. And some of them, you know, were very innovative. I thought the chat capabilities is a great suggestion for the 311 service. I myself hate waiting on the phone, and I use chats all the time. So, you know, I thought that was good. I wish, I guess, I had caught, because it's not sitting well with me, the fact that we had departmental reviews by different consultants, different methodologies, using different tools. Even probably their takeaway from the numbers was different compared to each consultant. And maybe it would have made more sense to have one person do it all. I don't know. Do you have any insight into that? Was it a barrier for your analysis, or?
Through the chair, I think that's exactly the role that we're performing.
Okay.
Is to help synthesize those.
Yeah.
To do some of the due diligence on it, exactly as you say. The expertise of any given firm may or may not extend to all of the areas that you wanted reviewed. And I think it would be entirely appropriate to go with the most expertise and then synthesize, as opposed to try and find somebody who could cover everything, but half of them at the wrong level of depth.
Okay, so you take that as your role right now to help us. Okay. And maybe I didn't hear correctly, but I think I remembered heard earlier in the presentation, was it said that these were not service reviews, or are these service reviews? Could you just clarify that?
So through the chair, there are probably 65 different public services that the city offers, and probably approximately 30 to 50 internal services, one of which is purchasing, for example. That's an internal service. A public service would be roads. I actually call it road access.
Okay.
That's what the public wants, unobstructed access to the roads. We might call it road maintenance because that's what we do. But what we need to decide is, what are we going to call it? And that's one service of many. Does that include winter maintenance, roads, or is that separate? What about street lighting? And so you actually need to articulate what all the services are. And once you have all the services, then each one of them will have efficiency and effectiveness indicators that tell you how you're currently performing. Then the question is, what do we need to do to make it more efficient or more effective, or both?
So is it fair to say this was more of a departmental review than service review?
Some of them are more blatantly that kind of review than others.
Okay. Okay. And the type of audits, I know we had some, I know the mayor and myself, when we were pushing for reviews and whatnot, we asked specifically for value for money audits. This is a value for money audit, or no?
Through the chair, this is not a value for money audit.
Okay. All right, good to know.
So let me just explain
Yeah.
what I believe the value for money review is.
Okay.
It's actually optimizing your efficiency and effectiveness simultaneously. And there's a curve where they will meet, where it's the optimal location. It's the most efficient and the most effective.
Yeah, that's what I think.
You're not there
Most
yet.
efficient and most effective net for you, given your financial wherewithal and your desire for service. Because you could maximize service
Yeah,
and not hit the net maximization point because you've spent 1,000 times more than you were expecting.
yeah, I get what you're saying. And lastly, I guess, whether it's positives or negatives, was there any eye openers that you saw during your analysis and your review that we should pay attention to, or?
Through the chair,
They could be
we
positive.
actually thought that the studies were done very well by the 3 consulting firms, the 7 studies, given the scope of the studies.
Okay, so we're pretty good overall in your opinion, I guess, yeah. I don't know.
Is there more work to do?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why there are those needs more work, that the third category. Why? They had to get it done.
Yeah,
We've had, the time we've had, that's the next stage. That's why we've reported on 2020
yeah,
and the issues for 2020. The other ones are either best practice, just get on with it, or the third category, you need to do some more homework to justify whether you should do it or not.
okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Singh. We've now completed the questions for today. So thank you very much for your presentation and all the questions and answers.
Appreciate that, thank you.
I would note to council, we have completed the schedule for today, and at our next budget meeting, we'll start on the departmental presentations that'll include community service, public works, engineering, transit, and corporate services, among some other service provider presentations. So do we need a motion to? A motion to receive the report, moved by Councillor Fortini, seconded by Councillor Bowman. All those in favor? Okay. We need a motion to adjourn today, is there? Okay. Yes, we have 15 minutes as usual? Okay, 15-minute public question period. Please state your name.
Hello, my name is Sylvia. I'm a resident of Ward 3. So a lot of our metrics are based on per capita or per 100,000. What population is Brampton using to determine these numbers? What are we estimating? I believe it shows 656,000, but that's from 2018.
Yeah, good question to the CEO. I noticed, I looked at a recent stats, was a report that one of the presentations, I think it showed it much closer to 700,000. What is the source of the population data we're using? Is it the most accurate?
Through the chair, I believe the source of the population data comes through our planning and building department. But I'm not actually, I don't have those on hand.
Maybe to our planning commissioner, good.
Yeah, basically, we do get our data from Stats Canada, but it does lag in terms of, the most current data, but maybe our director of policy has a better update on that.
So if the data is 2 years old at 656, and how many new residents are we getting a year?
Well, we're getting something like, we just had 5,000 units built, so 7,000, 8,000, 20,000 resident.
Yeah, so it could be closer to that 700,000.
Stats Canada actually estimated between 2017 and 2018, Brampton grew by over 30,000. Congratulations, you now run a city bigger than Vancouver. But some of the issues are, so transit, for example's goal is 2 service hours per capita. So to meet that for last year would have been 60,000, but the problem, so if you don't do it this year, you're gonna be 60,000 behind, and it will take you like 10 years to fix 1 year's issue because it's difficult to get enough people CZ licenses to drive the buses. Your library numbers per capita are also substantially down. Councillor Singh was a trustee. If the province says, we're not gonna cut the number of teachers, but we're gonna put 2 to 3 extra kids per classroom, would parents take that as a cut in service? Because the province says, we're not cutting the number of teachers, but to the parents it's, well, my child gets less time from teachers and less feedback. What is the metric? Your current projections on if you're cutting are, is it a case of, is it absolute or per capita? And so your population is going up. So your actual per capita spending is going down. So your library holdings may be going up, but if population is growing faster, it's more difficult to get a book. If I'm a resident, do I care? It's like, well, we didn't cut the number of books the library has, but what they know is it's taking me several weeks longer to get the books I want. So my mother's on the wait list for a book. The wait list is over 1 year. To her, do you think, well, we're not cutting the number of books, but it may take you 3 weeks longer to get a book you want. Do you think to residents that we're not cutting the number of books is an actual metric? So they're giving you the absolute numbers unadjusted for inflation, and those are one way to look at it, but your residents aren't going to be happy with, we haven't cut the number of books.
Advised by the acting clerk, the comment should be in the form of a question.
Okay. How is the numbers actually being reported to council? Are you actually looking at adjusting for inflation or per capita? Or is it actually, or are you just looking at the absolute total number, which means when you adjust for inflation and population growth, your actual level of service is going down per person?
Through the chair, I do maybe want to comment in terms of in terms of library. For instance, we did recently open up a new branch in the southwest portion of the city. That provides additional capacity to the population to obviously address the additional growth pressures in the city. So that's one area where we haven't necessarily realized the full potential of a branch that's in that end of the city, and so that has the ability to absorb additional capacity. If you can recall, also from my presentation, I did state that the assessment growth had declined. It's at effectively historical lows, and that's representative of a slowing in population growth because permits have not necessarily been at the same pace as we've seen in many years prior. So how that effectively gets picked up in the numbers over the next several years, we'll have to see how that results, and if there is a pickup, then obviously assessment growth would increase and we'd have more funds available to expand service for that population.
Thank you, David. Is there an additional question, Sylvia?
Why doesn't the budget meet the Ontario disability standards? So as of 2014, public organizations have been required that for non-text items, there should be alternate text. So I've looked through the budget, there's sections of text that aren't text. They're actually embedded in image. So if I'm visually impaired, I can't actually use a screen reader on it, which means it fails disability tests. Is there a reason why in 2020 we're not meeting 2014 requirements for accessibility in the budget?
David?
Through the chair, I was actually, I thought I was aware that our document did meet the requirements, but if the individual is suggesting that it's not, we will obviously take that back to our accessibility team, and obviously for
the numbers by the Treasury Department do all seem to perfectly meet it with how your pie charts have been set up. They definitely do meet that. But then like some of the earlier data sections, which are probably by the CAO's department, those are text in images and they've been compressed. So even with 20/20 vision, some of it's difficult to read. And because it's a raster, you can't blow it up 200% and make it clearer.
Maybe we'll get the accessibility falls under the clerk's office. We can get them to take a look at that and make sure that all our documents are compliant.
We'll take that away for sure.
I know my grandmother's visually impaired and she likes to give me advice, so we'll make sure that all our documents are consistent with provincial standards. Thank you. Any other public questions? Seeing none. All the additional delegations that we have set for another day. Anything else that we need to deal with directly today, just adjournment? Recess. So we're going to recess until
the appropriate motion would be that the Budget Committee recess until Wednesday, February 19th at 7 p.m.
Okay, so can I have a motion to recess the Budget Committee until 7 p.m. Tomorrow, the 19th? Moved by Councillor Santos, seconded by Councillor Fertini. We get to do this every day for the next week. Thanks for the first session.